today. There's going to be recording of this meeting, so if you have any kind of concerns with that, please keep your video off and it won't pick you up. But the exciting things we've got on the agenda, we've got an update from Samantha, who is the network manager of Alan, who's going to talk us through the activities Alan's been doing so far. Some really exciting stuff happened over the last 12 months. And then we're going to have regional reports from members from Alan from different parts all around the world, hearing what the status is in acute leukemia in different parts, and obviously very different experiences depending on where everyone is based. And then we've got a 15-minute break to grab tea and coffee. It's quite a long meeting, so do bear with us. Obviously feel free to disappear and grab a drink or use the facilities as you want at any point throughout the meeting. And then after the break, we've got a panel discussion on evidence-based advocacy and really why evidence and data is so important and how you can use it in your advocacy activities, and hopefully plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. So hopefully most people who are joining have now joined, and I'll hand over to Samantha, who's going to give the overview and introduction of Alan's activities. So thank you for listening.
Hi, everyone. So I have to coordinate myself, look at the camera on one screen and switch the slides on the other screen. So if you see me turning, don't worry. So I don't know if we need to go through a formal introduction of the network. Because I guess most of you have seen these slides already. So, but just as a very quick intro, so the network has been founded in 2017. We are a global network of patient organization and working in acute leukemia, as you know. And all that we do is patient-led, is collaborative, and is evidence-based. So if you have 3 words to remember, that's these ones. In terms of activities, so we have been given an update already when we met after EHA, but we have been progressing since then. So as ongoing activities from 2020, we have this ADP, so the Advocate Development Program. We are now almost finished with the program. We have had 8 webinars already. We still have 2 or 3 to go, and we are planning to finish the training by December 2021. It has been a very intense year for the trainees, but almost there. And so now we have 9 people who are fully trained. So quite exciting thing. You have more information. I've put the link if you want to know more. Another 2020 project that is still ongoing, it's the Global Quality of Life Survey. So as you know, we have run a survey in 2019. We have a lot of data because we have had 552 respondents to the survey. So quite a lot came out of it. We have been submitted and published 2 posters already. And we are now in the process of trying to publish in a journal. So that's ongoing, and so more to come in the future. Again, if you want more details on the program, you have the link where to find information. And so now moving to 2021 activities. So we have been running a series of webinars. We have run 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 this year. Some of you have attended those webinars. If you are interested of watching them again, you have the recording, you have the slides, everything is available on the website. And the same goes with the seminars. So we have run a series of 6 seminars with quite interesting topics, and this was given as an update post EHA. So same here, you have all the slides, all the recordings, everything can be found on the website. And you most probably have seen the awareness campaign, so the Be Leukemia Aware campaign alongside the World Leukemia Day campaign. We have been producing a series of materials, so World Leukemia Day talks, We have a spot, the World Leukemia Day thing, the infographic, some printables. All the materials is still available on the website, and you can reuse all these materials. It has been quite a big success. We have seen a lot of engagement, especially on the 4th of September, which was the World Leukemia Day. Quite funny, the infographic that you can see in the middle is actually the most used material that was created. So it has been used and reused and shared and reshared multiple times in various social media. So it's quite nice to see. My slides are not moving anymore. Sorry. Ah, yes, that's good. Okay, yeah, sorry. Some of you know, and maybe some of you don't know, but we have been also quite busy with ASH this year. So at the beginning of the... someone talking? Nope. So at the beginning of the year, we have sent a letter to ASH, which was co-signed by by 13 networks of patient organization. And the reason why we have sent this letter is that, as you know, as patient advocates, we are not able to attend ASH because of cost. So it was clearly a barrier for us to be able to attend the annual Congress. So we have signed this letter, and we have been having quite regular conversation with ASH, who have agreed now to provide free registration for patient advocates. So we have about 150 spots for ASH. So if you have not yet applied to attend ASH, I've put the link again. I have to say it's a quite lengthy process and not so friendly process. But once you're in the portal, then it's quite okay. I think the most complicated is actually to access the portal and register. If you have any issues, send me an email. I can try to guide you through this one. You may also have seen that we have been launching a patient experience survey. So that's a survey that Alan is running in collaboration with CLL Advocates Network and CML Advocates Network. It's a leukemia survey, so it's not only acute leukemia. It's about the diagnosis, care, and treatment for leukemia, and with the aim of providing information to help us understand more about what key issues patients are facing, what are the experience, what are the unmet needs. It has been translated in different language. It takes about 20 minutes to complete. I've put the link again on where you can find the patient survey, and as information, we have a carer survey coming out soon as well. So please, you can also promote this information via your social media and website and newsletter. We already have 230 plus respondents so far, so it's picking up quite quickly as well. And the survey is going to be open until end of November with potential extension to December. So still time to complete. And we also started to work on a patient preference study. So it's a lengthy process. It's going to take us about 18 months to 24 months to complete the survey. It's a big exercise for us, and it's actually the first patient preference study run in acute leukemia by a patient organization. We found out that there were some patient preference study run, but mostly by industry, and also usually it's or a ALL or an AML study. We are aiming to have acute leukemia in general study. And the aim is to understand what's important for patients. And now, so we have completed the literature review, we have completed interview with stakeholders, we have had workshop amongst us with industry as well. And we are now in the process of the study design with a first protocol to be expected by the end of the year, and ethics committee submission Q1 2021. And we are also involved in different projects, so Harmony Weekend, MRD Testing Collaborative, ECO, and various other projects. So if you want to know more, you have the link and you have my email, so you can contact me anytime. And I think, yeah, that was short, but again, if there's any question, I'm happy to take the questions because we have time. Otherwise, we can move to the regional sessions. Can move then to the regional sessions. Maybe we can ask people who have their micro on to go on mute because we can hear a lot of background noise, if that's possible. Thank you. Okay, so for the regional reporting session, so we have 4 speakers. So what we did, just to give you a bit of background, we met, we had pre-meeting prior to this summit, and we met by region. So I met with Fernando and the organization from Latin America. I met with Bahija from Africa. We met with Miriana and Pierre for Europe. So had a series of meetings. And we have been discussing the challenges, the issue, the project, and everything that was relevant to discuss during these meetings. And so we have Fernando, Bahija, Miriana, and Pierre were going to present what were the discussions and all that we discussed during the meeting. Just as information, Bahija cannot be with us today for personal reasons, so I'm going to try to present what we discussed, and hopefully it's going to reflect the discussions. So now I can hand over to Fernando, who has kindly agreed to be the reporter for today. And Fernando, just tell me when you want me to move to the next slide, and if you want to put your camera on as well.
Okay, thank you, Samantha. My name is Fernando Piotrowski. I'm going to briefly tell you about patient organization and the work they do in acute leukemias, as well as patients with these pathologies. Next. On October 4, the regional meeting of the Latin America organization members of ALAN was held. 5 organizations participated: Agalemo from Costa Rica, Fundación Colombiana de Leucemia y Linfoma from Colombia, Azopaleo from Guatemala, Maxi Vida from Chile, and Alma from Argentina. Next. During the meeting, each organization presented the work they do in general with acute leukemias, access to available treatments, and what the main reasons for consultation of patients with these pathologies were. As a result, we were able to know the situation of food, organization, and patients with acute leukemias. Next, please. We are now an organization of patients focused on leukemia in Latin America. Some having on the one hand, highly professional dedication with Abrale, Fundación Colombiana de Leucemia y Linfoma, Fundación Esperanza Vida de Colombia, Alma and Esperanza de Perú. And on the other, a group with dedication. This is the lack of financial source to sustain the functioning of each organization. In part, the situation is caused by sources funding the pharmaceutical industry, which inadvertently condense the group of organizations they are located in countries they are not commercially attractive to their interests. Next, please.
Fernando, I think we don't
Yes.
hear you so well. I think you have a problem with the microphone or something.
Okay. One moment.
Yeah, you are like a robot.
Do you speak? Do you?
Ah, yeah, it's better. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. We can highlight that in the member countries, we have different treatment options available for acute leukemias, from conventional chemotherapies to the latest in treatment, such as venetoclax and blinatumomab. Next, please. It is important to be able to differentiate that getting to the drug depends on the health service provider that the patient has. Access is easier in those who have private coverage, while patients in the public system take longer to access, since sometimes they must resort to legal channels. In this aspect, the advocacy from patient organizations is of great importance for both patients and caregivers. Next, please. As for the activities, patients get in touch with organization mailing because of difficulties in access treatments, emotional support, due to the impact of receiving the diagnosis, both for the patient and for the family group, for accompaniment along the news path they will have to travel since their diagnosis. Next, please. As for the activities, all organizations, career programs aim at educating and empowering patients, developing face-to-face and virtual meeting and awareness campaigns through the use of social media. In this regard, the support of the medical community is essential. Next, please. Thank you, all the organization that accompanies to develop this report, and thank you everyone for attention, and sorry for my English.
It was perfect, Fernando. Thanks a lot. Thanks for.
Thank you, Samantha.
Okay, so now I'm going to try to present what was discussed for Middle East Africa. So as I said, Baija is not with us, but so she anyway prepared the slides. And so the Middle East Africa region is 73 countries. It's a quite young population. A lot of different languages are spoken. So it's also something that is a barrier in the region, because English is not spoken everywhere. Arabic is mainly spoken. There are also huge differences between the different countries there. So if you take the example, for example, from the United Arab Emirates and the Niger, it's complete different situation. She also mentioned that there's a huge problem with reading and writing. So people do not necessarily know how to write and how to read. There's also, as you may know, a very difficult. Sorry, my English is also a problem today. Problem as conflicts, political instability, and there's also different markets which are emerging, and low and middle income countries. So a very different situation if you look at the whole region. And also, so the different issues in the regions are obviously access. So it's the main issue. There's a lack of monitoring and diagnostic capacity. There's a lack of specialized center, financial problems, absence of data on cancer in general. There's also obstacles like stigmas, poverty, belief, tradition. There's no clinical trial, no research, no facilities for transplantation. There's no psychological support in hospital. There's problem in informing the accessing, the information. And usually the women are most affected either by cancer because when they are patient, but also when taking care of the family. So it has an impact mostly on women. Lack of patient empowerment. She also mentioned it's a very specific culture, and usually people are quite ashamed to talk about their disease, and when they access the patient organization is usually because they need help. But she also mentioned that it's very rare that you would get a thank you from people that they help as organization because it's not part of the culture. So as a region, she mentioned that there's definitely a need to collaborate to improve patient outcome, to improve disease management in order to improve quality of life for patients. There's a need to engage with physician because there's no relationship with physician or very rare relationship. Need to engage the community locally to collect data, to build capacity in the organization. Importance of sharing best practice, organizing events in the region, and also to learn from other networks and to develop active partnership in the region. And then she wanted also to show you what she does in Morocco. So she's the founder and the president of the Amal Association in Morocco. And they do a lot. So when it comes to activities, they do a lot of support, access, awareness, advocacy, and they have a strong network as well. So they do educational material for patients, for parents, for families. They provide, they do a lot of prevention as well in prevention campaigns in school and in hospital. They have access to media and public awareness. They assist patients and families. They do psychological support as well for those patients and those families. They have regular meetings with the MOH in Morocco. They also do recommendation to medical and legal authorities. They support physicians. They do advocacy awareness campaigns. And they also do some trainings for HCPs. And they do also nurses training. So they are doing a lot, and she puts an example of what they do. So here are examples of educational materials. You can see here pictures of patient meetings. They do meet virtually with physicians as well. Here are some trainings. So as you can see, they are very busy. World CML Day, so they've been doing a lot as well. And these are the partners that they have. And this is actually a picture of the latest project. So they have been building, and that's actually the building that they have been building. And it's a patient and family home. So the building is situated just close to the hospital, and is really to make sure that patients and their families can access hospital, because in Morocco, you may have to travel like 5 hours on a bus to actually be able to attend your consultation with a physician. And they have found out that it's very difficult for patients, usually also on the financial point of view. So what they have done is to build this home, and so patient and family can stay there for free. And so they can definitely access their consultation or their treatment in the hospital. And so if you want to be in touch with Bahija, here are the details. And I think I'm done. And I will give the floor to Mirjana now.
Thank you, Samantha. Thank you for inviting me on this summit. My name is Mirjana Babamova. I'm coming from Macedonia, and I'm part of the Association for Help and Support of Patients and their caregivers within hematological diseases. Our association is established before 4 years ago as one of the basic needs of our patient to raise awareness about hematological malignancies. And one of our main mission is access to essential and novel therapies in our country and in the region. Next slide, please. So we have had a regional meeting last week where we have discussed about the difference and the challenges that Eastern European countries have for acute leukemia and for other blood cancers, because usually there are similar differences and issues when it comes about blood cancers, acute leukemias, myeloproliferative neoplasms. So the basic difference between Eastern Europe and the other countries is that there are a lot of issues and differences between Eastern European countries, those that are members of the European Union, for example, that is Czech Republic, Poland, etc., and the non-EU members country, where there is a huge difference in access to therapies, for example, and those countries are Kosovo, Macedonia, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, which do not refer to EMA as a general medicine agency. So in all of non-EU member countries in the Eastern Europe, there are a lot of challenges and issues with access to essential and novel therapies. Basically here in Macedonia, the access to essential and novel therapies are managed on that way that there is like a special temporary budget, but that is a temporary solution and that is not a final solution for the treatments and therapies for patients with blood cancers. There are challenges and issues with access to clinical trials, mostly because pharma companies are investing in the bigger countries, like top 5 countries like Germany, France, United Kingdom, etc. And we're a small country, and all the Balkan countries are also small, so there are not a lot of representative offices of pharma companies here, and there are very few clinical trials. Also, a big issue is lack of funding of the patient organization. Our opinion is because the pharma, usually the patient organization are supported from pharma companies. But in this region, in the Balkan countries, we do not have a representative office of pharma companies, and they do not sell enough treatment here. So that's why the budget is low for our patient organization activities. Also, one of the issues is a lack of advocates for acute leukemias. Usually, we have noticed that patients with breast cancer or women who have cancer are more active in the field of raising awareness or patient organization, but the patients with acute leukemia and with other blood cancers, especially acute because they are not chronic like the other leukemias, are very low active in this field. The big issue here is also the corruption. As I mentioned, until we are a non-EU country, the corruption and the rule of law will be our main issue. Also, people are very afraid to lobby and stand up for their rights due to the political situation. Actually, they're afraid that they will have some repercussions if they discuss publicly about the treatment or if there is a lack of treatment. So usually we are taking that opportunity to discuss with the healthcare institutions and with policymakers. Reimbursement lists have not been renewed for many years. So that is also a big problem for access to therapies. And there are a lot of COVID-19 controversies in delay of treatment, because COVID-19 is very difficult to be controlled here in Eastern European countries, especially in Balkan regions. We have had first no access to vaccines, then after the access, we still have delayed treatments. So we all hope that the COVID situation will end soon, and we will have our blood cancer patients will have a chance to be treated as a normal persons. In the countries members of the European Union, there is a better access to treatment. However, at times it may be delay in access. For example, 2 years or more, like for example in Czech Republic. There is also a limited funding for the patient organizations for the countries like Czechoslovakia, like Czech Republic, Poland. And also there are very few blood cancer centers, and investigators are struggling to enroll patients. There is a lack of referrals to specialized centers, and like in all the world, COVID-19 issues have made delay of the treatment, and that means that if the treatment is delayed, the patient will be diagnosed in a late phase, and that is not very good with the prognosis. As mentioned previously, there are also lack of advocates, patient advocates for acute leukemias. Next slide. So I would like to show you this map. The data are from 2016, but still they're relevant because it's the similar issue. The reimbursement of therapies in Macedonia has been blocked in the last 15 years. So we do not have any novel therapy on the reimbursement list here in Macedonia. In Serbia, between 2007 and 2016, just 12 of the 228 new medicines have received market authorizations and were approved for reimbursement. As a comparison, 148 new therapies were reimbursed in Slovenia, 83 in Bulgaria, and 62 in Croatia. Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Croatia are European members of European Union, to mention that. Why is that very important? Balkan countries to be a part of the European Union, because it will be a different way regarding the reimbursement process of novel therapies. Next slide, please. Also, I would like to mention that most patient organizations in Eastern Europe are not involved in the access discussion. So we will have to work more for this to prioritize it like a problem. Patient organization in Eastern Europe should work together on issues and challenges, especially on the issue of policy and public affairs work. Then health technology assessment is also a big problem, because a very few countries have here in Balkan region have a method of evidence synthesis that considers evidence regarding clinical effectiveness, safety, cost effectiveness, and also this can include social, ethical, and legal aspects of health technology. There is a need of integration of patient preferences into evidence-based practice. Also, we as a patient organization must work with industry on market access. For example, that means maybe it should be formed like some kind of Eastern European or Balkan community advisory boards for hematological malignancies, because that is a good way to point the question about the access in this region. We should work more with healthcare professionals to design joint initiatives. And maybe in the future, as an idea, establishing an Eastern European blood cancer patient organization network. Next slide. So these are the basic stuff. In general, there are a lot of more problems and issues, but I think this is the basic. So the one point is that all together we can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirjana. So now, if Anne-Pierre is around.
Yes.
Cool.
Can you see me?
Oh, no,
No, not yet.
not yet.
Oh, interesting. I see myself. All right.
Okay, I think you can move the slides. If
Okay. All
I hope.
right. Well, thank you. So I'm going to present some key takeaways, key trends that some patient organizations that we discuss. I mean, several patient organizations. So Leukemia Care in the UK, Lille, so the Danish patient organization for lymphoma, leukemia, and MDS. Also MDS UK, MDS Alliance, Flute of Light, a patient organization in Israel, and Laurette Fugain in France. So yeah, so maybe I can move. If not, yeah, next slide. But before I deliver on those key trends, I just want to sort of introduce myself briefly. As I'm a volunteer for Laurette Fugain, I am not full staff. So I'm a leukemia and bone marrow transplant patient advocate. I'm a volunteer. I have many volunteer hats, as you can see on the side. So two patient organizations, EGMOS and Laurette Fugain. Laurette Fugain is a member of ALLEN. I'm also contributing to, I'm a member of the steering committee at ALLEN. I'm a member of the committee campaign of the HTC project, which is a research project on graft versus host disease. I'm a board member of the Francophone Society of Bone Marrow Transplant and Cellular Therapies. And I'm also a member of the Patient Advocacy Committee of the European Blood Marrow Transplant Society. So these are my volunteer hats. I'm also a consultant on patient engagement and advocacy, and for the company I created, Care for Access. And some of you may know me through the collaboration that I have with advocates, and through that capacity, I'm providing support to Myeloma Patient Europe on their Access to Medicines program. So I just wanted to sort of, people might think, oh, I've seen you on different hats and here and there. So I just wanted to sort of clarify who you're talking to. So we can go to the next slide to start just touching on those key takeaways. And very similarly to other regions, so Latin America, across all regions actually, and it's the same in Western Europe, it's very hard actually to recruit acute leukemia patient advocates. Certainly it is due to the brutality of the treatment, and also the survival urgency. So patients need to rest, especially if they had graft versus host disease. And when they do, for some reasons, we still cannot quite identify, there are fewer acute leukemia patient advocates versus other blood cancer patient advocates. You can go to the next slide. One thing that comes across, but still, and it affects Western Europe as well, is that the continuity of patient organization is at risk for various reasons. Patient organizations rely very much on volunteers. They do have permanent staff, but for example, I'm a volunteer for Laurette Fugain, and also they're individual dependent. So this is something that our organization actually discussed and shared, is that if some key staff or key volunteers leave the organization, it's really putting us in jeopardy. So this is something, you know, we have to that we've noticed, and we have to figure a way to mitigate that. Certainly, and it's come across all regions, and still also impacting Western Europe. It's less money, but more things to do, and especially in the COVID era. So there has been a decrease in the general public funding, but also in industry funding in these very difficult times, because all the attention is so focused on COVID. So it's been a challenge for patient organizations in that sense. There's also been an increase in COVID related information requests, so which has taken a lot of our time to provide the right information, and information that kept on being updated constantly. So with regards to vaccination, with regards to the level of risks of unvaccinated patients, with regards to immunosuppressed patients, and you know, what could be the strategy for them. This has really been, more work with less resources. And in this context of COVID, and patients have had to face more expenses, especially patients that for economic reasons had challenges at work, or you know, they could not maintain their activity, or lost their job to COVID. So there's been an increase in patient requests for financial support. So we can go to the next slide. So patient travel and financial burdens remain. So I already touched that on the previous slide, but certainly in the same way that this affects other regions, there is a limited, even though there's a large number of treating centers, they still do not cover in an equitable way geographies in Western Europe. So there are geographical disparities in terms of access to treatment and care, so which forces patients to travel, adding the travel burden, so the fatigue around this, but also the financial aspect of it. So there's then, as I mentioned, there has been more requests for financial support to cover travel and or treatment costs. And certainly something we'd like to flag is, I mean, I know it's probably a given, and we know this is what we're all aiming for, but certainly more ambulatory treatment would provide very much, I mean, a day-to-day, a greater support for patients, because it certainly would reduce that travel burden, which it cannot be ignored. You can go to the next slide. So in our discussion, and Samantha, because she attended all of those pre-meetings, regional pre-meetings, Western Europe certainly has an advantage in terms of access to treatment, because social security systems in Europe, provide greater access to life-saving drugs. And that also, we're talking about Western Europe, and I'm also talking about Israel, as I mentioned earlier. And certainly it's something that we acknowledge, but there's something that all organizations agreed, is that there is access, but there are delays. There are long delays in accessing those drugs. They're being accessed eventually, but there are delays, longer delays than before. And also more and more, there is this strain of patient engagement in health technology assessment, which patient organizations welcome. And sometimes there is what happens in theory, we know on paper we're involved, but in practice, that involvement has been uneven, and patient organizations have not had always the chance to influence decisions and provide their perspective, I mean, critical evidence on patient experience with the disease, with treatments, current treatments, and with the experimental treatment if there had been prior compassionate use. Another point that is really, really interesting to our patient community is the increasing use of haploidentical donors. So I know everyone is very informed about what haploidentical donors are, but just just as a friendly sort of recap, these are typically a haploidentical donor is within the family. It would be a parent or a sibling, which is not a matched donor. So she doesn't have 10 out of 10 antigen in the HLA system. So, so there has been an increasing use, as you can see. These are French data from the Biomedicines Agency. You could say in 2010, 17 patients had a haploidentical donor, and there are about close to 500 in 2019. And this increase in haploidentical graft is based on retrospective data. So, it started as salvage therapy. There's no other option. So patients get, if there's nothing else, you have a haploidentical donor with, mixed success. But as hematologists improved on their clinical practice, and also based on that retrospective data, which I'm going to show in the next slide, but it's been an interesting journey and an additional therapeutic tool for the patient community, which we welcome. But I'm going to show, next slide. So a rough sort of summary table of data, retrospective data. So from the Italian data, so that's the first study, and then the other studies are US data. So, but these are retrospective analysis. So these are not prospective trials. So looking at past clinical practice, as I mentioned, initially salvage therapy, but then as also haploidentical donors are easier to find because it would be a parent, a sibling, or actually a grown-up child, especially in patients like AML, elderly AML patients. It's easier, it's cheaper, it's easier, it's faster, it's easier to organize. So, so looking at that data, the data has been suggesting that there is potentially a similar efficacy in AML and MDS, which is very interesting. But you could see there it's a suggestion in the sense that not all the data is actually pointing in the same direction, but there is enough critical evidence to suggest that it could be a viable option for AML MDS patients. And we could see that from the relapse and survival data. So that was the initial assumption. So those retrospective analysis, sorry, I'm looking up because I'm looking at the screen, but so the retrospective analysis, you could see that the statistical analysis were significant only on 2 papers for the Italian one, and so for the reduced intensity conditioning, and in the group 2 paper. And in those instances, it actually points against the use of haploidentical donors. But if you look at the data across, which is not statistically significant, there's still, interesting enough data to suggest that it might be. And the only way to find out is to have a prospective randomized clinical trials. So I'll go to the next slide to show, just to focus on the on the GVHD. This is where the data has been so far up until actually September. There has been in September 2021, the Acute paper was released in the Blood journal in September, end of September. So this is still retrospective analysis, but suggesting that potentially, there will be less GVHD with haploidentical donors. So we have data that's just not aligning. It's sort of somehow in contradiction. Some of it is statistically significant retrospective analysis. So we're looking at the Italian data. Some of it also statistically significant, suggesting actually that it's not the case. So the only way to find out is to actually wait for those prospective studies, next slide, which are currently ongoing. So to my knowledge, and there may be more in other geographies, and I know if some of you are aware of it, I'm really interested. I mean, we are really interested at L'Oréal Regard to know about those, but there are 4, I believe there are 5, but I know of 4 more in details, studies to prospectively compare the use of haploidentical graft versus match unrelated graft. And that would be the only way to find out in which patient subgroup this is actually a better therapeutic tool as match unrelated donors. And the data, and I didn't show data related to lymphoma or CML, but the retrospective analysis in other disease areas show different results. So the assumption is that haploidentical donors could be a better therapeutic choice than the match unrelated donor, so the MUD, in some instances, and there will be some criteria to take into account. So the disease, as I mentioned, but also the treatment, so the conditioning treatment. There are differences, whether it's a myeloablative conditioning or reduced intensity conditioning, also differences in terms of whether the patient received bone marrow, so that's just punctured and collected from the bone, or from peripheral blood, so stem cells, the age as well. So these studies are really interesting for us. And there's one that's fully dedicated to, that recruits AML, MDS patients only. That's the MAC-APLO-MUD that compares basically grafts, so 10 out of 10 match unrelated donors versus haploidentical donors. And even though the patient community really welcomes that, we're very cautious because, as mentioned earlier, we could see the data is just is very heterogeneous. So we're really, we want to make sure that for speed and budget concerns, patients are not giving a suboptimal option, which could be haploidentical donor. But maybe haploidentical donor would be a better option in some instances, and we really need to find out. So my understanding is that we will get preliminary data in 2022. So we're really watching that space. And then I'll conclude with a note on bone marrow donor recruitment and bone marrow donor registries. So there's something that, Laurette Fugard has been really how would I say, involved in advocacy to maintain the the maximum age for recruiting donors. So up until January 2021, people wanting to become a bone marrow donor or wanting to register on the registry could do so from the age of 18 to 51. However, that changed as from January 1st, 2021. Now it's from the age of 18 to 35 years old. There is a perfectly understandable clinical rationale for it because younger donors give the best options, best survival chances. Certainly is the case, but in the face of, at this point in time in France, especially, we have a small registry in comparison with other large EU countries. We have one of the smallest registry. So this, we just thought, yes, we'll go for quality, but we should not, exclude the fact that quality is not exclusive of quantity. But we actually didn't win that fight. But then again, we understand the clinical rationale, and it seems that there is a growing alignment between bone marrow donor registries to make sure that the maximum limit to register. So this is to register. This is not to donate. You can still donate until you're 50 years old, but to register to be on the registry, you have to be it's usually between 30 and 40 years old, as you can see. So in the UK, Anthony Nolan has always been on that line. So it's 16 to 30. And in the UK, and also the BBMR in the UK, it's 40 years old. But Spain so recently aligned, and France even more recently. So even though patient organizations understand the rationale, this is something we're worried about because we just want to make sure that there will still be match unrelated donors, because we're still not sure that haploidentical donors will be the solution, the one size fits all. as I mentioned previously in my previous slide. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne-Pierre. So do we have any questions for our speakers?
I've got a question if I can jump in. That'd be, I didn't raise the hand, sorry. I was going to ask Anne-Pierre, obviously there's lots of activities happening in Western Europe in particular, because perhaps some of the resources from the organizations, but how do you think some of these learnings could be adapted and used by other organizations in other parts of the world?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question. You mean what the learning is in what particular sense?
So some of the things you mentioned were happening. Obviously, you said Western Europe, some of the issues are the same, but perhaps we've gone further kind of in the health systems and some of the solutions. What could patient organizations in different parts of the world use and learn from what's happened already in Western Europe?
I mean, there are many instances, but I'll focus on health technology assessments, and it's a difficult. I mean, it's a very difficult question because, in many ways, the maturity of healthcare systems in Western Europe is such that that health authorities have finally welcomed the call from patient organizations to be involved. So I think what I would say is that don't give up in advocating for having your seat at the table. It will come it will come, and I think just stay, keep on being vocal about it, and seize opportunities to be at conferences that raise those issues. And I know it's challenging. Mirjana mentioned about corruption and the lack of transparency. And it's very hard to be somewhere when you're not aware that it's taking place. So I understand it seems like a sort of easy answer, but in instances where it's possible, just remain vocal, and hopefully you know, the voice will be heard. And this is something that we've seen in France, for example, in the UK, and then you know better the situation than I do. Patient organizations have been involved in the health technology assessment process for much longer than in France, and now it's being structured. Actually, it's been structured for the last 2 years. They created at the French HTA body, so the Autorité de Santé. They actually set up a fully fledged department for patient engagement, and their role is actually to make sure that patients are being consulted. So this is something that it's interesting, and patient advocates in France certainly looked to the UK and what the UK has been doing to call for having a seat at the table. So so I think that would be one first thing I'd say.
Thank you. If I may ask a follow-up, because I don't see anyone else jumping to ask questions, but maybe they are and then need to raise their hands. I was going to say one of the things that I think is really important is access to science, to be able to take part in some of these things. And obviously Alan, and particularly Samantha, led a campaign of patient organisations to make sure, as we heard, that we're all able to attend ASH. This year, for the first time ever, it's free. Previously, it was about $1,000 as a patient organisation to pay just to attend the conference, whereas now it's free. I mean, how important do you think it is that everyone at this conference registers for free to attend and learns the latest science? Do you find that useful in your advocacy work?
Well, it certainly is, and I think, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. We're not doctors. We're not going to be able to understand all the details, for sure, but there are, and we hope there'll be more patient advocacy tracks, but just understanding the key takeaways. I mean, we have to be able to to know what's going on, to know the latest, may not be able to explain. We certainly will not be able to, unless supported by doctors, obviously hematologists, but not be able to understand mechanism of action in details and everything, but still understand, which drugs provide benefit to which patient's population, where, and understand clinical practice. That certainly is very useful for advocacy work, but also being able to interact. I know it's virtual, but still, or connect with hematologists and provide also that patient view on treatment. I mean, we've all heard in clinic, in conferences, safety profile is manageable. And it's always making me laugh. I'm thinking, manageable for who? Manageable for the hematologist, as in they know how to handle it, or manageable for the patient? So we need to be able to attend those conferences and ask you, what do you mean by manageable? I mean, what point of view, what's the point of view? This is manageable in what sense? And this is that sort of data that goes to regulatory authorities and go to HTA agencies. So we need to make sure that that patient voice, that patient view, that lived experience is also brought into the conversation.
Thank you, Pierre. I think, Jill, you've got your hand raised for a question.
I have, thanks, Zach. So it's a question to Pierre. So thank you for sharing the data about the numbers of people on the bone marrow registries across Western Europe. I was, I guess, surprised that it seemed very low. And I know in the UK, despite sort of a lot of campaigning from Anti-Northern and DKMS, the numbers represent something like just over 1% of the population. Yes. So do sort of advocates across, sort of globally can share strategies to sort of increase the percentage of population that sign up for registries, and sort of is, I guess, opt out the way forward?
I mean, it certainly has helped, the opt out has certainly helped for solid organ donation in some countries, but it's a difficult one. There's a lot of, I may not say something politically correct, but there certainly are differences between the registries that are run by the government or a health authority, and registries that are actually run by non-profit charities, as in yes, that are not dependent on government budget. So you will see, if you look at the list of all the registries, and this was just an extract. It's not all the registries, obviously. There, I was just focusing on some countries, but for example, and I know it's an issue with registries, but so the number of German donors, so we're about 40 million people are on registries worldwide. Of those, about 11 million are German. I mean, and you would think, wow, the Germans are so much more altruistic, and that's just not the case. It's just that they have a very, very efficient organization called DKMS that has actually created an affiliate in the UK, in the US, also in India, and they're running this in a, I don't want to say professionally or a business, because if I say one, it means that the others are not professional. If I say it's a business, it's negative. But they're doing social marketing. They're really applying the principles of social marketing in a very, very powerful way. And they are doing a lot of recruitment at universities, schools, a lot of awareness campaigns. But because they don't have a limited cap, like in France, for example. That's the amount, we have, the target is 20,000 new donors per year. And that number is not a result of a calculation of this corresponds, there's no algorithm behind it, as in this corresponds to medical need. This is because of budget constraints. And yeah, DKMS has been, and actually Anthony Nolan has been also very, very efficient, don't get me wrong, but it's certainly, they've done this in a way where they fundraise very, very efficiently. They're just, there's a very strong, the very, very strong difference. And actually agencies run by ministries of health take a dislike at DKMS. But 65% of French transplanted patients have a German donor. I'm saying thanks to DKMS. So I don't know if I answer your question, but it's very hard to just tell you exactly what works, what shouldn't work, if that's the opt-out. It's not the case in Germany. And interestingly enough, for organ donation, Germany is doing really badly, but they're doing really well from bone marrow donation. So it depends on which organization is in charge. And in Germany, there are 28 registries. DKMS is only one of them. And all of those registries are actually gathered together and all that data is being fed into the national registry. So there is definitely a map. It's not just DKMS. It's the other 27 registries represent about 1.5 million. The rest is DKMS, but still it's quite massive. So yeah, it's there are differences in practices, and I think they have more freedom to operate because they're not part of government or they're not a government agency. And the US represents the larger contributor because it's just obviously there's Be the Match is behind that, and so they have a very large registry. I see Jan.
Jan, yeah.
Yeah, actually, thank you so much for all your presentations. My question is actually going to Mirjana. I was struck by the slide that you have shown about, let's say, the different needs and challenges of the organizations in Eastern Europe, within the EU and outside of the EU, and a lot of topics were listed there. I'm just wondering, how could Alan help, given Alan can, of course, not do much on the national level, but it can support on the cross-cutting things between the different member organizations in the network. So how could Alan help if you look at, let's say, the diversity of the two almost regions inside and outside of the EU in Central and Eastern Europe?
Yes, Alan has helped us a lot until now with, as a newly formed global, as a newly formed network. But still, as I mentioned, again, I would mention the access because it is the main issue here, and there's also in the Eastern European countries. Maybe you can organize something like Myeloma Patient Europe has, like a type of discussions between Eastern European countries that are part of the European Union and that are not part of European Union. Just like a work group, something like that, to discuss more about the issue, because I'm not always, I do not always the situation in every country, and in this work group, it can be like a work group. Maybe there should be a representative from each country and each patient organization in those Eastern European countries, to start something to point to the healthcare authorities and to pharma companies that we have really big problems. We actually like living in Africa and still we're in Europe. So maybe that's one type of idea, but I don't know if you could realize this.
May I add something to that if it's possible? It's Lydia here from HEMA. Also, once travel is permitted and things like that, just having somebody from a network come and speak with our not healthcare providers, but with our policymakers here. We would organize a meeting and even like the clinical director, just to explain how important patient advocacy is, because believe it or not, our policymakers here, our Minister of Health has no clue what a patient advocate is. And even though patient advocates are not meant to be politically aligned, in the east of Europe, if you are not secretly politically inclined, you're just ignored, and there's just no help at all, and there's not even a collaboration. So that's the depth of it on this end, and sometimes a letter even could help. And like I said, again, once travel is permitted, a meeting just for somebody from the level of what Alan is, these European global networks, I should say, actually has an impact. I say, oh my God, look, HEMA or these other organizations from the non-EU countries are members of such organizations, and they will listen that way. When there is like a higher type of authority, they do take note. Thank you.
So I don't have a question. It's more of a comment, and it's something we have been discussing with Fernando. So Fernando and the other groups from Latin America, and so I think we can agree from what we have heard that in a way LATAM is not the worst place when it comes to access and innovation. Well, at least in the region where Alan has a presence, but the biggest challenge that they feel is the sustainability of the organization. Like, for example, Fernando is a full-time representative for Argentina, and there's a bit of resource there, but then, and also as Anne-Pierre and Mirjana were mentioning, the biggest fear is then when people are not there, what's going to happen with the group, what's going to happen with the presence in the country, and ultimately what's going to happen in the region. So again, not a question, maybe food for thoughts as well on how we as a network can also ensure a bit of sustainability in those organizations. I can see Mirjana, you have unmuted yourself.
Yeah, even myself, and that's already happening. That's already happening because we had our colleagues in Hungary, Mona, had to dismantle. So that's already starting. The organizations are starting to disappear from this region.
Yes, because
so help is needed.
Yeah. There is a good option also. I will mention myeloma patient Europe. They have a scholarship program every year, and that is a way that you as a network can help to patient organization. For example, for one project, they award a scholarship to several patient organizations that can apply. And also we need help with resources as well, especially for the blood cancer awareness month. We're very thankful for the resources that you have managed to provide us. We have a lot of Facebook followers and posts and Instagram to be educated more about the awareness. So that's an excellent stuff that you are doing as a network.
Thanks. Are there other questions, comments, thoughts? Everyone is silent Friday afternoon. Okay, well, if there's no questions, then we have a longer break than expected, because we were planning for 15 minutes and you are going to get 45 minutes. So you can even have breakfast, lunch. You have a question, Anne-Pierre?
Actually, I have a question to the other regions in terms of the clinical practice of haploidentical grafts. I was wondering, I don't know enough, like if in South America, I mean, in Argentina, if it's practiced a lot, and in Central Europe also it's practiced, in Central Eastern Europe it's practiced a lot because it's cheaper than a matched unrelated donor. So I'm wondering if you have seen an increase in haploidentical donors in your respective regions.
I can answer for my country. For example, the University Clinic of Hematology is organizing here some campaigns for donors, but still we are on a very low level.
Okay, but they're not asking brothers or sisters who are not matched. Is there an increase in, rather than looking for someone on the registry, are there more clinicians that actually go for haploidentical? So that means that they're not fully matched. You know, they only share half of the genetic/biological card. So is there an increase in asking brothers or sisters that are not full match, complete match to be the donor? Do you know?
I'm not sure about is there or is there not, because here we do not have a cancer register for start. Then other data are very hard to be determined and to know. So I'm not sure. I can ask the health professionals that we collaborate, but it will be an unofficial information because there is no cancer database in our country. Still not yet. There is planned in 2022 to be published, but in the moment there is no base for donors or I can ask and then I can write you, I can answer the question.
Thank you very much.
Baija was mentioning the same for Middle East, Africa, and she was talking especially for Morocco as well.
There has been an increase in haploidentical donors, you mean, or no? Or
No,
there's no cancer registry?
No, there's no registry. There's no registry.
Okay.
There's no
way of knowing.
No facilities, nothing.
Okay. Thank you. I don't know if Fernando is still online.
He's still online, I think, but well, I have a so just in case Fernando then wants to jump in, he can. But I have a question actually for Lorraine. So Lorraine is based in South Africa, and my question, Lorraine, if you don't mind jumping on the camera, is can you relate to anything that was discussed from your country perspective as well?
Yes, everything. It's one thing I've learned is, you know, the geography changes, the problems don't. In South Africa, you know, we have two healthcare systems. So we look at we have to look at access in both healthcare systems. Transplant is pretty accessible in South Africa from a technical point of view, in that there are transplant units that get done, and it does appear on guidelines and so on. One of the issues that we do have is that in South Africa, we have a lot of stigma when it comes to donating your bone marrow, a lot of misunderstanding, particularly within the Black African things. It's a cultural belief. So that's something that we There is not, so the politics between our registries, our donor registries, is quite complicated, but there is a registry that is run by doctors, and then there's a registry that was a patient group that was done, and they've now subsequently joined with DMSK. So in Africa. So that's something. So we're looking at that. Obviously, you know, there are issues with donor matches just because of the lack of the African genealogy on that, as well as then the costs that incur. So if we look, so that's in the public sector. The public sector, there are three transplant centers that serve probably about 45 million people, and the rest. And then in the private sector, there are a few more, and that only serves about 18 million people. They're far better resourced, and what I like to say is, you know, it's the paint on the walls is prettier in those private hospitals, but from a clinical point of view and a healthcare professional point of view, the care is the same when it comes to that. One of the bigger problems that we do have in some areas in private is that the people that fund fund the treatment in private would rather go to transplant before exploring any other treatment, unless it's basic treatment with chemo basic agents. And then another issue also is the impact that it has on financially on some of the patients. You know, you look at a patient that, say, for instance, is, I'm just talking generally, all leukemias, who has to travel for treatment. I mean, that the decision to spend that $5 is whether my family eats or whether I go for treatment. Often we also see, particularly with kids, where kids are abandoned because of the treatment, and a lot of the kids treatment is actually managed, and the psychosocial is managed by civil society and NGOs rather than the government. So yeah, there are a lot of similarities. I think the effects are just different in that you know, the abject poverty in South Africa, we also look at late diagnosis. So, you know, when signs and symptoms start presenting, we're sitting and looking at it, and 80% of South Africans will go to a traditional healer before they consult Western medicine. So that's something that we're looking at as well from an early detection point of view, is trying to do that.
Thanks, Lorraine. And so maybe a question to all of you, well, to our reporters, and maybe Lorraine as well, if you want to stay. To me also is a question regarding the perception that physicians have when it comes to patient organization. Do you know if physicians are talking about patient organization and where their patient can get any kind of support, or do you feel that it's a totally underused resource?
So from a South African point of view, particularly in the hematological space, not so much in solid tumors, but in the hematological space, there is immense pressure put on patient groups, particularly for those psychosocial care and treatment, and what we call the soft care after treatment. That stuff's not provided by the government. So the only option that the healthcare practitioners have is to rely on the civil society and on the patient groups. So we have a significant childhood patient group where, houses are given because we only have 7 or 8 treatment facilities in the country, and the whole country has to travel to that. And, so there's that. So yeah, particularly in hematological settings, we have incredible amounts of issues when it comes to that. Secondly, when it comes to, say, for instance, just palliative and end-of-life care, our hospices are so overwrought with the patients with HIV and TB that sometimes cancer patients and particularly hematological patients get the wrong in the last bit of the step, and we run out of that space for them. But that palliative care is completely patient, in South Africa, is completely patient group run by hospice. There's very few state things, but the patients are sent to the patient. From a private point of view, the doctors, I don't know, they have their own things. There are not very many adult-specific groups in South Africa when it comes to hematological diseases. I think there are hematological cancers. There are 2 that focus solely on it, and it's literally within the province, a few provinces, not even national. So we take on a lot of that as well because there isn't that focus. So we have to run projects that are linked to the hematological patients and so on.
Thanks. Mirjana, Lydia, if you're still online, what's your perspective on that? Because you mentioned, Lydia, you mentioned before that payers do not have a clue about patient advocates, but is that the same with physicians?
Not all physicians. There are physicians who recognize the patient advocacy, but just in a position of awareness. So the patient advocacy for them is only raising awareness. They do not know that patient advocates can be involved in health policy issues, patient engagement. They still don't know that patient advocates are also involved in reviewing the clinical trials for some academia and pharma companies, because they still think that patient advocacy should be on a level of awareness. Though I must say that our healthcare professionals here are trying very hard, and they're very good experts with the patients and with their caregivers. They're trying a lot to do for them for diagnosis and treatment. Still, the system and the corruption and the political situation has a lot of impact on how these regulatory affairs are going, and why the patient advocates are not involved in decision-making process. And we do not have a lot of patient advocates that are educated that they can do this lobby to healthcare systems. They think that they should stick to the awareness only.
Thanks, Mirjana. Anyone would like to complete?
Hi, Samantha, it's Tracy.
Hi, Tracy.
How are you? I just, from the perspective of the United States, I can tell you that we've just completed interview process of about 40 out of the 80 centers of excellence that our foundation is designated in the States. And it was upsetting to learn that many, if not most, of the physicians we interviewed don't recommend the foundation or use our resources. And, there are some that we work very closely with that, that we do provide our resources to, and they do distribute them, or they send patients our way, but most don't. And when we question them about it and we say, are you aware of what we offer, of the educational materials that we have? They all say, oh, that would be a really great idea, but then they still don't do it. So we're really struggling to find out why. We don't understand why that, because we recommend patients to them for second opinions, and that recommendation isn't reciprocal, even if it's just something as simple as a business card. You know, this organization exists, you've just been diagnosed, but for some reason, it isn't happening here.
And Pierre? Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear the US experience, and to some degree in France, it's also that way. Though there is quite a strong relationship between so patient organizations that would fundraise to for research projects. So there is a link between clinicians, researchers, and those patient organizations. But when it comes to the patient experience, presenting a patient being with hematologists, it's not getting into that conversation of, you know, if you need help, you know, these are the patient organizations you can go for. There's no signposting. So they know patient organizations exist, but it's sort of perception is that they do, it's about raising awareness, collecting money for research, but raising awareness in more like in a broad general public term rather than providing peer support or doing advocacy. It's just, so there is, yes, I think there is definitely, when it comes to, well, the Laurette Fugain has a grant research program. They all know about it. There are two, for bone marrow transplant research, there are two patient organizations in France that have a fully fledged grant research program. And yes, they all know about it, but it doesn't come across in their conversation with patients, oh, you should go and speak to a Laurette Fugain representative, they might provide help. It's not, it's just that it's strange. They know we exist, but it's not coming in the conversation.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because the one thing that was very consistent across the interviews, when we asked what we could do better, it was provide them more research funding.
Yeah.
It wasn't patient related.
That's what I'm, so see, it's interesting how it sort of fits in the same place. Yeah.
Okay. So I think this time everyone is quiet. So let's go for a break and let's convene again in 25 minutes for our next session on, if my computer, and on evidence-based advocacy. So enjoy your break, enjoy your coffee, your tea, your lunch, your breakfast, and see you in 25 minutes. Thank you.
Which is not everyone's native language. So if I say anything that's too complicated or too quick and confusing, just interrupt and let me know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about evidence-based advocacy, what it is, why it's so useful for us as patient organisations, before sharing an example of a project that we've been working on in the UK at Leukemia Care. So evidence-based advocacy is really a mixture of different types of things for us as patient advocates. It involves collecting data, but it also involves the interpretation and kind of use of that data. But the thing that's really different about it as a patient advocate is this is always with an objective in mind. We're always using it as advocates to try and drive change. There's no point generating data for the sake of it. We're not academics, we're advocates. And the reason for generating this evidence is to make your advocacy work more effective and to enable you to do things on a national level, so that when someone says, well, have you got proof of that point? You've got evidence, and you're making sure all of the things that you're doing are grounded in data, and you can show that they're correct. So why use evidence? I mean, I'm joking a little bit here with this slide that people will believe what you say if you use evidence. Obviously, they will, and evidence adds credibility to your activities when you're doing it. And particularly as patient advocates, we often get told when you turn up with one person's opinion, well, that's just your opinion. Are you representative of other patients? And using evidence can answer that question and show that yes, the points you're making are representative of the whole patient community and of a broad number of patients, and that therefore you should be listened to. The second one is about understanding. So this applies to all stakeholders, not just to us as advocates, but it also applies to us. So if you look at the left image on the slide, this is the perspective of a secondary data source, someone looking on and trying to understand someone else's experience. And on the right, from the perspective of the baby, is the user's perspective, what's actually happening. And as you can see from the user's perspective, this baby toy is totally not fit for purpose. All you can see is the bottom of some animals. And this is really why listening and generating evidence on the patient perspective is so important, because nobody else understands the patient perspective. And nobody else can see it from that point of view. Perspective is really important. It's not just about factually how things are, it's about what perspective are you coming at. And personally, I'm a strong believer that there is a responsibility on the patient community to use evidence to drive change. We've had so many processes, and we've heard a lot today, where you turn up and people don't want to listen to your opinions. A lot of decisions that we want to influence as academics are based on very rigorous science, whether that's clinical trials, whether that's policy decision making. And to be kind of credible partners at the right table, in some cases we have to turn up with evidence. That's not always the case, and that's not always feasible, but there are certain things where evidence is simply the standard that's required, and to get involved in those conversations, you need to bring evidence. Now, evidence has a lot of different meanings and lots of different types that you can use, and you don't always have to turn up with a massive, great patient survey, but you do have to be rigorous in the types and the ways you collect this evidence. And when you're thinking about how to use evidence, it's really, really important that you actually listen to what the evidence says and act on it. You don't start from the perspective of, I've already decided what the outputs are, let me go and generate evidence to back up my point. You do it from the perspective of trying to understand an issue and then listening to what that evidence says. Because it's really easy to go in with pre-confirmed views of what the evidence is going to say and then ignore anything that contradicts the decision you've already decided that you want to say. And particularly, it's important for everyone that the methodology is sound, but particularly as advocates, we quite often get criticised on the basis of our methodology, saying, well, you asked the wrong people, or you didn't ask enough people, or you asked the people incorrectly. And so it's really important to think in advance about your outputs and think about what criticisms people might have of your methodology. It isn't just about saying you had a methodology, it's about, is that methodology sound? And will it stand up to criticism? Because it's really annoying when you develop an important project and people don't talk about the findings and question your really important evidence as to what matters to patients. They just talk about the methodology and they go, we can ignore the findings because the methodology was flawed. And that's really unhelpful as advocates when we're trying to bring things that show the patient's perspective, and quite often nobody else is bringing that type of evidence if the whole discussion focuses around methodology. And the way to stop that is to make sure the methodology is right in the first place. And then when you've done some evidence generation, one of the most important things is making sure your evidence is actually the right type of evidence. So does your evidence answer the question you fundamentally want to talk about? If you want to talk about the emotional impact on people, did you ask questions about anxiety or depression or need for emotional support? They're three totally different types of question, and you can't use one to infer another. You can only limit your comments to the evidence you have generated. So if you want to talk broadly about emotional needs, you need to collect that type of evidence. If you want to talk specifically about anxiety, you want to collect that type of evidence. So did you ask the right question in the first place? The second one is, did you ask the right people? I mean, if you want to talk about someone being diagnosed with AML in the last 18 months in the COVID period. It's no good asking people who were diagnosed with AML 3, 4, 5 years ago. But if you want to understand the perspective of an AML patient living through the COVID period, then you want to ask people who've been diagnosed at different time points, because you want to understand those who were diagnosed during COVID and what their experience was, those who were diagnosed before COVID and what their experience was and how it changed during the COVID pandemic. So you need to make sure you're asking the right people. The third one is, did you ask enough people? If you're in a country like the UK, where there's 10,000 people diagnosed with leukemia every year, if I ask 3 people for their opinions and call that a survey, then quite frankly, I'm not doing my job. You need to make sure that the number of people you're asking is representative of the types of point you're trying to make. So if you're trying to talk about leukemia patient experience, you need to ask hundreds in the UK to make sure your conclusions are actually kind of valued and kind of relevant. You just haven't asked enough people. Otherwise, you could have picked 2 people with totally irrelevant experiences that are not representative. And then the next points really depend kind of a bit more kind of scientifically on what you're trying to achieve with them. But is the conclusions you're taking from the data actually what the data is talking about? So are you drawing the right kind of considerations from it? Are you interpreting what it actually shows? Are you interpreting enough data? Are you looking at kind of differences between different questions in the survey and saying, could any of those influence each other? And you get a bit more into the detail there. So key elements if someone wants to consider running an evidence generation project for evidence-based advocacy. There's 6 main steps, but I'll break them down into 3 different chunks because I think they go together in that way. So the first chunk is the stuff you need to do before you consider running a survey. So that's strategy and research question and survey design. You need to think about what is the purpose of the survey? What questions are you trying to answer? And that tells you the strategy for setting a questionnaire. And one of the things we know is, despite the fact evidence generation is increasing amongst the patient community, and has done over the last few years, we're not necessarily being very strategic about it. We're not thinking about what evidence do I need to generate and answer the points that I want to answer. And really, that's the starting point. You shouldn't do anything else until you've understood what you're trying to do there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The second is, once you've got that question set, the thing you want to understand, you need to design a survey. And you need to look at questions that exist already, see if you can borrow kind of already tested and well-worded questions. So people like EORTC have a question library that's freely available online, where you can look at tested and validated questions on key topics, and you can borrow from them and insert them and put them in your questionnaire. Or if nobody's asked a question about it before, you have to write your own question, and you have to think about, does that question actually address the topics that you're trying to get information on? The second stage, and it's actually the easiest stage, is when you want to run the survey. So implementation, which is kind of making sure that all the technology works. If you're doing it online, if you need it in your country, have you got approval from ethics to do so, and what data protection measures do you need to get? Are you collecting individuals' information, or are you making it entirely anonymous, which makes it a little bit more straightforward? And then the second part of actually running the survey is the survey itself. So recruiting people to take part. Have you got members? Do you have a database that you can promote it to? Have you got social media that you can promote it to? Do you run support groups where you can have flyers and give it out, and making sure that you get responses? And this is obviously particularly complicated if you try and do it across countries or with lots of different groups involved, because different people will promote it different amounts, and then you'll get different response rates in different countries depending on how kind of active the different groups are. And then the third part of running a survey, which we quite often think of as the simplest stage, but it's actually probably the most complicated stage, is using the results. You've run a survey and you've got a whole page of data, and you want to know what to do with it. And the usual problem here is nobody's thought about it until they've run the survey. And you need to be thinking about this before you run the survey from the outset. So when you think about your strategy question at the beginning, what are you going to do with the data? How are you going to analyze it? Would you want to present it somewhere? Would you want to put it in a journal? Would you want to present it at a big conference? Would you want to kind of put a public report? Would you want to summarize the findings? There's all kinds of different things you can do with it. And by thinking about your outputs at the beginning, you make sure your questionnaire is appropriate for the things that you want to try and do with it later. I mean, if you want to present it at a scientific audience, you've got to make sure the methodology is very, very sound. Whereas if you just want to use it for internal planning, then it's just about generating information and quotes is sufficient. You don't need to necessarily go into anything statistical. So have a little bit more of a deep dive into some of these areas. And if you didn't get it from the last slide, be clear from the start how you want to use the data. Until you've decided what you want to do with it afterwards, don't do anything else, because you'll be running off in the wrong direction. It's better to move slowly in the right direction than to move quickly in the wrong direction. So answering that question, how do you make sure you're moving in the right direction? You have to say at the outset of the project, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? And be very, very clear and focused on what you're doing. Again, we're advocates, not academics. We're not collecting data just for the sake of it. We're collecting data because we want to achieve something. So think about what it is you want to achieve. If you want to influence an access decision for a new drug, think about what the body who makes that decision wants to know. Don't think about what you want to tell them. Think about what they want to know. Think about what they already know. What data are they getting from other sources? If it's access to a new treatment, it's probably clinical trial data from the pharmaceutical company. What they might not be getting a lot of, and what you might want them to know, is the patient perspective of that new treatment. So don't focus on anything to do with the clinical trial data, because that's already covered. Focus on the experience and perspectives of patients on that particular treatment. And also think about focusing on the perspectives of patients who are getting some of the comparator treatments. So you can say what that experience is and why this new treatment may or may not be better than that. And think about what types of evidence is going to be most persuasive with your stakeholder group. That really depends on who the stakeholder is. And everything then flows back from this. So imagine the day you want to use the evidence. Imagine everything you want to sit there and say. If you're going to present it at, for me, say in the UK, a NICE committee meeting, think about everything you want to sit at that NICE committee meeting and say. Or you could even write it out if you want to go that far. And then when you're designing your strategy in question, think about what are all the bits that you're missing in that gap you want to say, because that's your research question. That's where you need to generate evidence. To help you do this, if you want a kind of quick guide to doing it, this is based on a kind of psychological technique to understand different types of issues, and it's focusing on what's already known to different people. So thinking about what type of evidence generation you might want to run, because there's a whole variety of different types, depends on what's already known. So if something is known to you and known to other stakeholders, particularly the one you want to influence, that evidence already exists. You don't need to do anything. If it's known to you, but it's not known to others, or might not be known to others, particularly when it's something like the patient experience, you probably want to generate evidence to prove your point. So you probably want things that are quantitative. You might want things that are statistical. You want to give some kind of level of numbers to it. So rather than saying we have patients who experience this, you can say 30% of patients experience this, or 40% of patients experience this. You can say with some degree of certainty. If you're not sure whether it's known, i.e. you've come across a new issue and you don't know how widespread it is, the first step is quite often to do some desk research to see if it is known to other people. That doesn't really involve any actual new project, new survey, anything like that. Just find out what's already out there, whether that's as far as searching in the academic literature, if it's just looking at what's available online. It's a good starting point before you delve into generating a whole project of evidence where there's already evidence that exists. And then the last type, and possibly most interesting, is qualitative evidence searching. So where it's a new topic and it's not necessarily known to you, and it may not even be known to others. Things like focus groups, things like individual interviews will help you learn about things that you never even knew were an issue. Because you can't understand everything that's going on in a leukemia type. You can't yourself be representative of different experiences. You can't be both male and female, be both young and old. So there's always going to be different people with different perspectives to you. And the only way to understand that is to speak to them. And I usually find that if you want to run something like a quantitative survey, it's a good idea to do some qualitative work through focus groups or interviews beforehand to make sure you're asking about all of the topics you might want to think about that are relevant in this area. So I've already touched on this a little bit, but considering the different types of evidence generation, you can do a mixture of them sometimes. That's usually my favorite approach, which is you can either do a pure questionnaire where it's just tick box, makes it really simple to fill in, makes it quite simple to analyze because the answers are either 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, or yes, no, maybe. However you decide to write the questions, they're really easy to analyze and they give you numbers. So if you want to prove something and you want to say, here's the number of people it experiences, it's straightforward. They're easy to use, they're easy to analyze. If you want to understand something a bit more, interview style questions, written, open, are really good for understanding, but they're not particularly good for evidence because you have to do thematic analysis of what the words mean and why people are saying certain things, and it gets a lot more complicated. And personally, I like a mix of the two. So if you wanted to run a project about the experience of people undergoing stem cell transplant for acute leukemia, then one of the things you might want to do is you might want to run a questionnaire survey with mostly multiple choice questions, and you might want to have 1 or 2 questions that are interview style open written questions where you don't plan to analyze them, but you can take quotes that are really useful to inform. So when you want to present something, you don't just turn up with a big long list of numbers, you turn up with some numbers and some quotes that give some context to it. And in terms of where to get these questions from, I've already kind of touched on this, but if you're doing patient experience research, quite a lot of the time you may need to create them yourself. But actually, it's worth starting and looking at, are there existing patient-reported outcome measures in your area that are already validated? Or are there questions that are available via a question library that you can use and borrow? Or even, can you talk to other patient groups in your disease area to see what surveys they've run? And I can certainly say as Leukemia Care, I'm happy to give copies of the questionnaire we've run in the UK to anyone who's interested in using them. If anything, it makes sure we can compare between things in different countries, but it also means people don't have to write questions from scratch. So if it needs saying again, just to be clear, don't just generate the evidence for the sake of it. Be clear at the start about what data you need and how you're planning on using it. And one of the things I should really say here about evidence generation is you can be involved in it. You don't necessarily need to do all of it. So Jan's somewhere here on the call, but Jan and other academics and other stakeholders got involved in developing this patient involvement in R&D roadmap. And this really shows opportunities for patient advocates to get involved in projects that will generate evidence, whether that's clinical trials, etc., on the things that matter to patients in the setting of it. So you don't always have to be the one that runs the project. Sometimes you can be involved in external projects that generate the evidence and will do so quicker or in a way that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do on your own. So that's my kind of overview section. I'm going to move now to a case study from some of the stuff we've been doing in the UK to really give an idea of how we generated the evidence and in particular how it's been useful, what we've done with it, which I really think is the most important bit. So this was a project that we ran in the UK called the Living with Leukemia survey. And the aim was to understand UK leukemia patient experience. in particular to look at different types of leukemia and see how different bits and different experiences, where they were similar, where they were different, and really use that in a way we'd never done before to say, kind of benchmarking some of the issues. So things like information provision, are people given a booklet at diagnosis? See how that varied between AML, ALL, CML, CLL, and see what the differences were in leukemia patient experience in things that could be controlled and were related to the health system, not necessarily just related to the leukemia type. So we designed a questionnaire that basically took you from the moment of diagnosis onwards until wherever you were at that point. You didn't answer questions going forward. You only answered up to, had you had a stem cell transplant, yes or no? How many lines of treatments had you had? You only went up to the point you were at. And to make sure that the questionnaire was as good as it could possibly be, we did a series of what's called cognitive testing with different patients with different types of leukemia in the UK, to make sure all of the questions answered different things that someone could be looking at, and to make sure that there was always an answer option when you looked at the question, and to make sure we'd considered a wide variety of possible kind of experiences. We've run this questionnaire a few times now, and one of the reasons for doing that, and to use the same questionnaire or similar bits because we've added and changed and tweaked, is to make sure that you compare across time and say, are things getting better? Which ones are getting worse? Have some things fundamentally ceased being an issue? Have some things become issues that weren't issues? And this is particularly important now in the context of post-COVID, and saying which issues have changed, which have become better or worse over the last 18 months. And really important is obviously we start looking at designs and changes for the health system post-COVID, if that's a term that we can use. So the methodology for this project was actually really quite interesting. We split into 3 different groups. The first was, so in the UK, there's a project called CPES, which is the NHS England's Cancer Patient Experience Survey. And that looks at all different cancer types and anyone treated in a fixed time period in a hospital in the UK, and says, what's your experience of that hospital care? And one of the things you could do for this survey was you could send a second survey, which is what we did here. We could send a second survey to that group. So that group is as close as you can get to an average NHS patient. So people who may or may not be connected to patient groups, people who will have had a wide variety of different leukemia types, different treatments. They're as average as they can be. The second group was anyone that was on Leukemia Care's database with a postal address. So we compared to paper versus paper because the other version was paper as well. And this was people who had used Leukemia Care's services or had got in contact in some way. And obviously all patients, and making sure we could therefore look at comparing between the cohorts, differences between people who use patient groups and people who don't, or may not from the average group, to see how their experience differed, i.e. were some issues likely to be worse, and that's what caused them to reach out for support, or were there some other things that caused them to reach out for support? And then the third was an anonymous online link. So this was available to anyone, whether they were on social media, whether they were responding from other patient groups. And again, that was to do a similar thing to the Leukemia Care link, but also to compare between Leukemia Care data and other data to make sure we kept them all separate. And this project has had quite a lot of different output types. So in a pre-pandemic world, when we held physical meetings, I presented it in the House of Parliament in the UK to launch the findings of this report. We put all of the data in a publicly available report, which is available on the Leukemia Care website. If anyone's interested, you can read the answers to all of the questions. It's all anonymized and aggregated, but the intent of it is that this data is available for people to use, so they can take the information and can use patient experience without having to go and run that report themselves. Obviously, this is UK, so if you're using it in other countries, it may or may not be relevant for some bits of it, but it gives you a starting point that's better than obviously not having a starting point. The second thing that we've done with this is we've published it scientifically in various places. So we've published it at the British Society of Haematology's conference. We've had some posters there. We've published it at the European Haematology Association conference. And in particular, we've published different subsets. I mean, there's 100-something pages of reports, so we haven't published the whole thing in that context, but we've taken out different bits of analysis and really deep dived into certain sections that might be interesting scientifically. And because of the kind of level of data that's available, we've actually also used it as a starter for other projects. The problem with evidence generation is you run a project and it tells you what you wanted to ask at the time, but it gives you more questions than answers some of the time. So it sparks ideas for other projects that say, oh, we asked that question, but we only asked 2 or 3 questions on it. What we really need is a whole survey or a whole focus group to understand why people have reported answers the way they have. And that's personally why I think evidence-based advocacy is so interesting, is because it gives you ideas and questions that you hadn't even thought of at the start of your project. So a quick run through now of some of the different other ways that we've used the evidence in our activities beyond just generating it. So the first one was this report I mentioned, which was to help us define what the unmet needs were. So we quantified issues, we looked at differences between them, and we created a set of recommendations and solutions that could drive some of our activity going forward. I mean, we turned up with not just evidence of issues, but evidence of how we could potentially solve those issues. The second thing we then did with this is we used it to inform everything we did as an organisation in our strategic plan. So we set a 100-something page report of these are the activities we need to do. These are the kind of services we should be running. These are the campaigns we should be initiating. And we did it based on evidence. We looked at what the experience of people affected by different leukemia types was, and we looked at what concrete actions can we be taking organisationally to try and change those, so that we run the survey. Again, we can compare differences and say, have we fundamentally improved those issues? Are we focusing on the issues that are most important to patients? And then, in the spirit of evidence-based advocacy, we set targets and what we called key performance indicators, which measured our outcomes and impact against those areas to say, what does good look like? What's a good amount of change? And are we actually achieving that? And comparing across years. And as part of that strategy, one of the things we did was we developed new services. So if you've got evidence as to where the issues are and where the needs are, you come up with different ideas and different ways of solving those issues because you genuinely understand the topic. And really importantly, you can evidence to others the topic. So you can outreach to funders and say, this is the issue, this is how we're trying to solve it, this is our idea, this is why it's needed, will you fund it? It's a much more exciting proposition than turning up with, we think this is an issue, this is what we're thinking about doing, and any interest in funding it. If you turn up with concrete evidence of a problem and encourage others to get involved with what you're doing. And then the next thing we did with it was we shouted it from the rooftops. So we used it to inform all of our campaign activity going forward. We used the evidence we had internally through the survey. We used external evidence such as where and how people were being diagnosed in different settings. And we used it to inform our campaigns. So we changed from talking about leukemia awareness to talking about leukemia diagnosis and saying in the UK, we know the general public know what leukemia is. What they don't know is what the common symptoms are, and they don't know to visit a healthcare professional if they're experiencing those symptoms. That all came from evidence, and it changed our whole messaging behind the campaign and has made it, whether it's reached more people or not, it's not really the point, but it's made it much more effective because it's focusing on the actual issue which we wanted to solve, which is early diagnosis. And it also sparked other kind of campaigns and provided the evidence for them. So we did a campaign in the CLL space called Watch, Wait, Worry, and we looked at the impact of being diagnosed and placed on watch and wait and what that meant from a patient perspective, not just clinically, but what did it mean in terms of information, understanding how worried and concerned people were, and were there strategies that you could do to try and address it. And we did some we did some quite weird stuff with this. We launched it at the British Society of Haematology conference. We gave out kind of evidence reports to clinicians, but we also produced a guide for patients. And we had kind of a Willy Wonka style golden ticket chocolate bar with which you could win a watch. Is Watch, Wait, Worry. So we got lots of people really engaged in the campaign we were trying to do. And we made sure we had plenty of case studies of how the issues were affecting and concrete recommendations based on evidence as to how clinicians could change the way they were providing support and management to patients. And one of the most interesting things that came out of it was we found that patients who were given at diagnosis and then placed on watch and wait, patients who were given a clear and understandable explanation were much less likely to be worried and concerned about it, and particularly those who were given written information. And what was most interesting was it was actually worse to be given a bad explanation than to be given no explanation at all. People were more likely to be worried and concerned if you explained the topic badly than if you just didn't say anything about it at all. Really important evidence, and really for us helped campaign and get the clinical community involved in why you need to give written information and why you need to give a clear and understandable explanation about watch and wait at diagnosis. And then I think this is my last slide. The last thing we've mostly used it for is health technology appraisals. So obviously, as Anne-Pierre mentioned earlier in her talk, in the UK, we get invited to be involved in decisions about patient perspective and about values of new treatments and kind of effectively campaign for access for treatments for leukemia in the UK. And it's really difficult to use evidence to influence this process because the process isn't designed in a way that necessarily encourages that. It invites you to sit at the table, but it doesn't like you to have an impact on it. But what we really focused on is we focused on collecting evidence as to the points where NICE considers there to be uncertainty and where they want to understand the patient perspective. So if they're saying how many patients have a stem cell transplant in this setting, and that makes a big difference to how much the drug costs, we try and make sure we've got evidence on what percentage of patients in that setting will have a stem cell transplant, because it's not as good as a clinical trial data, it's not as good as NHS data in the UK, but it's better than not having any answer to the question at all, and it's better than it just being informed by clinical opinion. So we go away and we try and make sure we've got that evidence and helped it. And so far, and I'm not saying it's all down to us, we haven't had leukemia drugs that have gone to appraisal being turned down, because we've made it very clear as to the needs, and we've successfully campaigned for access for every single leukemia drug that's been appraised by NICE in the last 3 years has been approved in some indication in some sort. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I think we're going to save questions till the end when we've heard from everyone else's presentation. But yeah, thank you very much for listening and looking forward to everyone else's presentations as well.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, Jana?
Good afternoon from Prague, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to the panel and to present on 3 examples of patient-led advocacy, which one is global, one regional, and one national. So coming first to the global one, it is the famous adherence survey conducted by a CML Advocates Network. With more than 2,500 respondents from 63 countries and in 12 languages, it has brought the first robust data on adherence to anti-cancer drugs. And it changed the assumption that was in some medical societies, like in my country, that why should patients not take their anti-cancer drugs if they are adherent in taking medication prescribed by their GPs to what is called banalities. Because this survey was patient-driven, not pharma-driven. We could compare adherence within a spectrum of drugs. We could identify patients at higher risk of non-adherence, and we could identify therapy with increased non-adherence. These results of the survey were assessed as very valuable contribution by the whole medical community. It had an oral presentation by the head of the working group, Giora Sharf, at EHA. We had a poster at ASH. And next slide, please. And I had the pleasure of presenting it later on at the John Goldman's conference of the European School of Hematology, where there was a great number of Czech medical delegation, and I saw them in the audience nodding when I mentioned patients could see the findings of this survey have been implemented in the medical practice. So by now, this piece of work has met its goal. Next slide, please. The next example is again within the CML Advocates network, however, regional. CML Atlas is an online survey, not among patients, but among patient advocates in Central and Eastern Europe and West Asian region. It's quite recent. It took 3 months till March 2020. And it looked into different data on access to therapies and monitoring for CML treatment. The first part was statistic on the number of CML patients, hospitals, specialists treating, national registries and hospital registries. Then data on different types of therapies, their access, the pricing and availability. Same for the molecular testing, access, pricing, and the frequency of testing. And we looked also into clinical trials, recruiting and trials ongoing, and the study centers. Next slide, please. This is a poster which was recently presented at ASH. And what were the main challenges? The respondents had difficulties sometimes in finding reliable information because some information was not publicly available. So the successful approach was the one in collaboration with physicians instead of involving patients or volunteers. For instance, in our organization, a CML expert has recommended a doctor in junior position because doctors know how to do this kind of research, and we gathered precise and great volume of data. So the outcome of this project was we developed a strong advocacy tool, and already last year during the CML Community Advisory Board, when discussions came across the access to CML drug in Kosovo, this data was used, and as a result, since September last year, 15 patients got access to a certain therapy on the budget of Kosovo government. The data, of course, is not carved in stone, and for sure we will need to update them in period of time. Next slide, please. My last example is on the national level. First step in involving patient in assessment processes in the Czech Republic by changes in the healthcare legislation. This goal was accelerated by establishment of a patient advisory board of the Czech health minister in 2017. I was nominated on behalf of hematology patients, and the group of 25 patient advocates, representatives, worked on different novels of healthcare legislation, but of course with the main focus on the definition of patient organization. There has been some debate over the type of legal entity, because in our legislation, patient association has not got a parallel equivalent, but the majority of patient organizations were in the form of society, whose members are patients with particular disease, who have majority in governments of the organization, and where helping patients, representing their position and supporting their rights is the major activity of the organization, alongside with the transparency of financing. What were the challenges? To get consensus on the type of legal entity was the biggest debate. For some reason, ministry had a clear preference on the society, a certain type of legal entity, while let's say institutes and equivalent to public charity would have been disadvantaged and left out. However, these organizations performed strong lobbying in the Czech parliament when this legislation was under debate. So now the final definition includes multiple legal entities. And main things that it has been implemented into the legislation, and therefore gives more clarity on the position of patient organization in the healthcare system. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jana. Do you want to speak on this picture? No.
This is just an illustrative picture when I made the skeleton of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. So Lorraine, it's your turn. Is Lorraine?
Afternoon, everyone. Is that great? You can see me?
Yeah, we can see you. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have to tell you, when they told me about, when Samantha sent the email to talk about data, and Michaela spoke to me and said, you know, we had to talk about data, I was like, what am I going to talk about? Like, you know, we don't have a research arm and we don't do this. And the more I got to thinking about it, I realized how entrenched, even without you even knowing it, data is in your organizations, or should be in your organizations. For me, data is not just the numbers. So at Campaigning for Cancer, our aim is to remove barriers for access to treatment. And we do that at making sure that patients get the right treatment at the right time with as few barriers as possible. And that's generally what's driven us for the last few years. But I want to go right back to the beginning of Campaigning for Cancer. And if you can change this to the next slide. So just to give you an example, so Campaigning for Cancer was a conference. Idealistically, there were 4 of us that got together, and we realized that there wasn't, we knew that there wasn't a focus of cancer in South Africa. And we thought, well, what we'll do is we'll have a conference. And then what we'll do in the conference is we'll get all the stakeholders together. Mind you, it was the first time that all those stakeholders had been put together in a room, and we'll ask them what the problems are. And then we'll see what happens. And then what we'll do is we'll bring some international people in, and we'll teach everyone about advocacy, and then they'll go out forth and advocate. Yeah, that was in 2008. By the second day of the 4-day conference, we were told by the professional advocate that had come out from Canada that unfortunately this was now our baby, and we would have to, everything that was highlighted in the conference was going to become our problem. So effectively, Campaigning for Cancer started with a body of information that we had, because we'd had 4 days of all the stakeholders complaining. So our body of information had a credibility because everyone agreed on the information. Everyone agreed that the data we'd collected, some of it qualitative, some of it quantitative, was agreed upon and was a foundation for what we would do. And today at Campaigning for Cancer, still after 13 odd years, that initial discussions that happened form the basis of the strategy for the organization that we have. So the data that we began with became the building blocks for an organization that is now 13 years old. We can change the slide. So what did we want? Well, we realized in South Africa that there was a problem. That even though we had all this data and these experiences and this knowledge of what was wrong, we weren't going to be listened to. And the reason being is that we'd had a significant argument between the government and patient activists. And South Africa was going through a point where healthcare was dominated by activists. So when you walked in and said you were an advocacy, they were like, well, we don't want to talk to you because you're going to stand outside and protest and we'll have to call the police. And then they said, well, we also, we've got the biggest problem in South Africa is HIV/AIDS. Cancer's got absolutely nothing to do with it. It doesn't even feature on the burden of disease. And this was before the NCD. So we said, okay, well, what are we going to do? And if you can just put down on this, we realized that we had to define from that body of data that we got in the thing, what were the things that we as advocates, not as patients, as advocates wanted to do. And we wanted to make sure that from the stories we'd heard that we wanted access to effective treatments. We wanted them affordable and available. You can go down again and again. So we'd also heard that there was a need for timely decisions. We'd heard that there were delays. At that stage, people were getting, it was taking 10 years for a chemotherapy to be approved at our Medicines Council. So patients were waiting 10 years for new novel therapies. We also wanted to say that we wanted to contribute. We wanted to have our voices heard. And I'll never forget the first time we ever managed to get into a room, we had to get a court interdict to be included into that discussion. We used the evidence and the data that we'd collected from that conference, together with what was in the Constitution. We put that together and asked for access. And then the last thing, if you push down, was we wanted to have a say. We wanted to have a say in making decisions. And these were all quite lofty things that we wanted to do, but it gave us a basis of credibility, because people could see we'd taken all this complaining that had happened, we'd taken the data, taken it down and crystallized it and put it on there. And I'll never forget, and I do this every single time, it's become a mantra of mine every day when I woke up and every day in the office. That same Canadian advocacy consultant that told us this was now our baby, he told us there were 4 things that you have to remember in advocacy. Number 1 is you seize the factual high ground, and you need data to do that. Number 2 is you seize the emotional high ground, and you need data and stories to do that. Number 4, you find partners and allies. Number 3, you find partners and allies. And in order to do that, you have to have credibility. And as Zach said earlier in that, credibility comes with being able to back up what you're saying, not only in facts and figures, but also because you've done enough research and you understand the situation that's happening. You've looked at the data and you've formed an opinion on that. And your opinion is justified and your opinion is set in fact. And then the last thing that you have to look at is keep the momentum, and this is very hard because the momentum is you have to carry on, but that's for another day. When you're tired and downtrodden and thinking you're not getting where you need to be fast enough. But there's another thing with momentum is you have to keep the momentum of your data, because your data changes. And as the data changes, and sometimes you're the reason why that data changed. In South Africa at the time when we had there, we didn't have a national cancer registry. Our national cancer registry was 10 years old. It took us at least 18 months after we reformed to make sure that there was an effort to update that cancer registry. And today, it included legislative changes, it included policy changes, and it included behavior changes of how we reported cancer in the country. And today, we have a cancer registry that's up to 2018. Is it a fantastic cancer registry? Absolutely not. Is there underreporting? Absolutely. But what we did and what we looked at doing was to say, we will push you to create the data that we can use. So rather than creating my own cancer registry, I looked at whose mandate was it, and I advocated that they did the work so that they would be able to provide me with data. Why? Because if they synthesized the data, it was their credibility. They couldn't fight with me once that data was being given back to them. So often something like that, and this isn't particularly when we come to resource constrained organizations and also resource constrained healthcare systems. Data, you need to, as advocates, understand and let your position be informed by what's going on and what you've heard. And then once we've got that and we've created that and told everyone what we want to do and we weren't crazy and they didn't have to call the police on us, we would then look at, well, what did the patient need and how we knew these things were right. We had to just show what the real world evidence on that, what was really happening on the ground to move the political needle, the political will needle for us. So if we go to the next thing. So we came to the point where we said that in order to have the conversations, we needed to change those conversations that it became about the patient. And probably about 6 years in, the South African government handed us an absolute gem. They said, we as South Africa take it as policy that there should be universal health coverage. And everyone was like, oh, that's never going to work. How are we going to do it? But as advocates, they gave us a platform to work on. And what became the word that we looked at, because it's enshrined in our constitution, was the word equality. And we started creating information and collecting data of what each one of those words meant. To say, well, technically, what does equality mean? Equality in terms of medicine, equality in terms of legislation, equality in terms of universal healthcare, equality in terms of our constitution. And we came, and we can go on to the next slide. We came to the point where we realized that we missed when people when they were defining what equality was, that wasn't the word we wanted included in the work that we would do as South Africans. Because in South Africa, we have an absolute dichotomy and differentiation of the haves and the have-nots. So the next thing became, well, how do we look at moving the needle from this decision of equality to equity and justice when it came to patients? And we had to start looking at the patients, the 3 little patients that were standing there, and understand where they were coming from. We also had to understand what blocks, what of those cartons or the crates that they were standing on, what they were, what they contained, and why they weren't good enough. And then looking at taking the 2 and saying, well, if we gave this to enough, what did we need to get to equity and from equality to equity to justice? And justice made us look at the fence itself. And that was the biggest thing that we had to do for data, because finding the information and the data from the patients, that was easy. We just looked for patient stories and we took those things forward. When we looked at the crates, we thought, well, this is going to need a little bit more. We're going to have to understand what the structure of the healthcare system is currently on what it's delivering. And we needed to take the as-is data and create it and develop it on that. And then when we started currently where we're looking at now, looking at the fence, we had to intrinsically look at the structure of our healthcare system, what we are afforded legislatively, what we are afforded in policy, and what we are afforded in the Constitution, and start to move the needle on it. And each one of these set us about collecting data to prove what we were saying and to go back to what, as advocates, we wanted to do. So the next point that we started to look at was you can go to the next slide, thank you, was a series of collecting this information. And I have to tell you, there's something that people used to ask us. In the first 5 years of our organization, we hardly touched the patient. We hardly spoke to a patient. We hardly looked at providing direct services to the patient. Why? Because we had to lay the ground of the data collection so that when we started presenting our platform forward on behalf of the patients and for the patients, we had a solid set and a solid base of data. And that started, as I mentioned, in 2007 at the conference where we thought it'd be a good idea and that everyone would learn advocacy. The one thing that I've learned, and I want to say it to every single person today that's attending this meeting, you are the 1%. You are the 1%, because only 10% of patients will likely advocate for themselves. And only 1% of those patients will look or will move forward and start to advocate for others. So it's easy when people tell us, oh, well, we'll just create more advocates. That's great. You can create more advocates, but to be an advocate is a special skill. It's a special kind of personality. It's a special kind of drive that happens. And that's something that we've realized recently, that when people talk about creating advocates, you don't create advocates. Advocates are born. So while we started that, we thought, well, how do we get this 1%? How do we make sure that we speak to the other 90%? And how do we include them in our efforts? And that started in South Africa in 2011, where in 2007, we developed a consensus patient charter that formed the basis of what we were asking for, our idealistic issue, what we wanted to see, the idealism behind it. In 2011, we created a forum, and we've done those 5 years of and 4 years of hitting the stakeholder road and trying to co-opt stakeholders to understand that we were responsible and credible into a forum. And that forum was eventually endorsed by the Department of Health. And out of that forum, every single cancer NGO in the country worked together to put forward the patient stories. And we held it in the parliamentary room, and the patients stood up and told these stakeholders their stories. And out of that, we drew the information, and we got the stakeholders and the decision makers to put a call to action. A call to action that we would all be able to work towards. And once we had that as a foundation document, we then started looking at taking individual stakeholders and asking them for the policy changes, the timelines, the pricing. So we started to drill down and become far more specific in our data and looking at it. Always again, finding allies and partners to either provide us with the data or to talk about the data, because they provided credibility on that. And then last, we did a civil society call to action, where we formalized civil society into one strategy that we were looking forward to do. Now, I can tell you something. As Campaigning for Cancer, we play a disruptor role in cancer advocacy in South Africa. A lot of the times, things we start, we don't finish. We hand them off and move on to the next thing. And that's data told us that there wasn't anyone looking at the gaps. people were getting stuck, and I heard it today. The advocates were willing to look at perhaps doing talks or education material or so on, but they weren't willing to do the advocacy. And I think that from us realized that there was that gap, and that while we had to create the openings for the doors to find the people that were far less risk averse and create a pathway for them to then take over so we could go and knock down the next door. If we go to the next slide. So if you look at it, these were some of the things, and we started to put the information that we got, and the slide didn't turn out very well, but we started to put the information we got into specific areas and to explain the differentials, and then for what we needed, and put the education and that too. So we also then started to say, well, how did we prove pictures? How did we look at making the pictures relevant, and how did we find the data that we want? You can go to the next slide. We started asking the question that everyone would answer. We started posing questions to stakeholders that were easy to understand, that we knew that every time they answered that question, they would start looking at the data, and the data would lead them in the right direction. So we said, well, what was the meaning? What did the advancement of medicines mean for patients? That was the question that we started asking, and it was a relatively easy question to ask stakeholders, because it felt rather it was nothing. It was a very philosophical thing that they wanted to talk to, and we started to present the data that we collected over the years. And if you go to the next thing, we started to put it forward. The next slides, as I said here, started to put it forward that the answer every time that question was asked, the answer became a national cry. It means nothing if they can't access it. And that became the basis by which we started every conversation, and that became our emotional high ground that we would do. And all we had to do then was make sure that we had the facts and the data to back it up, with people around us willing to say the same thing. So then we started drilling down, and if you go down to the next slide, we started saying, well, then we need to call to action, and we need to call out people on the data. And every time we presented data, we said, we would ask, can we really say patients are getting the right treatment at the right time with the least challenges? If the answer is yes, then our work is done. Until the day that answer, the data doesn't allows us to answer yes, we can then put it forward. We also then said, if we continue to do what we're doing and what we've done before, are we dead in the water? Is the thing sustainable? Do we need to start looking at other things? And we would present the data that put forward and said yes. And then we started looking at commitment, and we said, well, you can be dedicated to a cause, or you can see it as a obligation that restricts your freedoms. And we started to put the legality behind it, and that not only was the obligation there within the Constitution, but also there should be the dedication as a human. And by asking these questions, we framed every piece of data that we've done. And I can say over the last 10 years, we have managed to use this in order to ensure that there's a national cancer registry, that there has been a national cancer control plan, that there are 3 published cancer policies from the department, and that there are 3 another in the working. Are all the problems solved? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. South African patients, I can say that we are still not getting the right treatment at the right time. But what we have done is we've made data back up the emotion behind it. And we've created and presented it in a way that the people, while asking those questions, become accountable to that data. Because every time we ask the question and present the data, we know that in the face of that data, they can't answer yes, or they can't answer no to that question. And then the last slide, I think what we need to do, which we always talked about, was to say, well, where do we get that data from? And this is a national effort. We needed to find those data and that the data for the emotional high ground, the factual high ground, and the partners and influences from everyone, so that there was a sustained national effort for advocacy. I'm pleased to say today there is a sustained national effort for advocacy in South Africa, and more in NCDs. And then the final thing and the final question that I always put forward to the stakeholders and to leaders is something that's undeniable. And I think that's something that we as patients should be saying more often, and that's on the next slide. That we need to remember that we're the patients, we're the experts, because we live with the condition. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lorraine. So next speaker is Tracy.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share today. So for what I'm presenting today, the concept was exploring an unmet need. So during when we were able to have our live events, we noticed that the patients and caregivers that were attending our patient and family forums, when we would discuss their specific MDS subtype or their IPSSR score, they would glaze over. So we started having the nurses ask live in the room, how many people know their score, how many people know their subtype, and we were finding that the number seemed really low. So we understood that knowing their subtype and their score can empower patients to become shared decision makers in their care, and we thought that this was an educational initiative that we really should jump on. So next slide. So we decided to do some research. And we started with a campaign name, a thought in mind that knowledge is power. So an empowerment campaign to teach this education. But first we wanted to make sure that we were right, that patients really don't know this information or their caregivers. So in October of 2019, we released a survey. It was a quick survey. It was, I think, maybe 2 weeks to a month that we had out. We had 577 respondents, 421 patients, 122 caregivers, 34 identified as other. Of the patients, 50% knew their subtype, 50% did not. And their score, 31% knew their score, but 69% didn't know their score. And then of the caregivers and others, 57% did not know their loved one's MDS subtype, and 75% did not know their loved one's IPSSR score. So we concluded that there was significant room for improvement in educating and empowering patients and caregivers to take that more active role in their treatment decisions with their healthcare teams based on the knowledge of these individualized criteria. Next slide. So we decided to start with a campaign, and the campaign began with infographics. Now, this is something that we did internally. We wanted to keep costs down. So Leah Harrison on the MDS Foundation staff was project manager, and she took it upon herself to work with a designer and our medical and scientific advisory board to build infographics. That was going to be our first level of education in this space. So as we were building these infographics, things were becoming more investigated, especially during with our international working group for the prognosis of MDS. They revised the original IPSS scoring system, and they were working on a mutation version of that scoring system. So as we were creating these infographics, we added know your mutation to know your score and know your subtype. And we began to share these infographics through social media and on our website and in our printed newsletters as kind of a first touch point on making our audience familiar with this information. Next slide. As we were getting really good feedback from our audiences and from our medical professionals, we decided to put the information into a microsite, a Knowledge is Power microsite, and you can see the site there. It addresses information on know your score, know your subtype, and know your mutation. It's got all of the same graphics as the infographics, but it goes into a deeper dive in each of the explanations of all of the categories that make up the scoring system and the different subtypes, including the conversion in 2018, the new classifications from WHO that came out that year. So we even put the old subtype names next to the new subtype names to draw those parallels. And we also worked on Know Your Mutations, and we listed the most common mutations that were present, that we were finding were present in MDS, with a deeper dive on explanations of those mutations. Next slide. Understanding that our patients are primarily elderly, we also wanted to have a printed piece. So we took all of the information that was on the microsite and we created a brochure. We have, you see there on the left side is Dr. John Bennett, who's on our board of directors. He did a bit of a forward in the beginning of the brochure explaining the need, but everything that's present lightly in the infographics in more detail in the microsite is also present in this brochure. And we did a proactive mailing to our database. We mailed out 4,000 of these brochures to the patients and caregivers that had attended one of our webinars, had donated to the foundation, or had requested an information packet from the foundation. So that was a paper mailing. And that brochure is also available for download on the microsite. Next slide. So to wrap up, what we're planning on doing with this information is later this month, we'll be releasing a very similar survey to the first survey. So the same questions on subtype and score, but also adding in questions on mutation, just to see if by putting all of these pieces together, these educational initiatives, we've moved the needle at all on this education. And that will give us an idea of where we should go next. Maybe things that we should, we'll do a follow-up survey to this follow-up survey to suggest, have you seen the website? Have you seen the materials? And ask perhaps for any additional ideas for ways that we can improve. I also wanted to mention that as the chair of the MDS Alliance, and I know some of our steering committee members of the MDS Alliance are also on this call, but we have a complimentary global campaign through the MDS Alliance this year for MDS World Awareness Day called Learn Your Type. So very similar, this is these are animations that mention each one of the MDS subtypes, and this will be primarily a social media campaign for October 25th.
So thanks. Do the 4 speakers want to come on screen yet? They can. We miss Lorraine. Yeah, okay. I think Zach and Lauren, you're on mute. Tracy as well. Jan has a question.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a question to all of you. I mean, impressive project, and congratulations to all of you from all the different perspectives. And I know how much it takes to actually implement such a project to generate evidence. I would be interested in your perspective where the limits are, where are the problems, what are the challenges that you experienced in setting these projects up and running them? Because I know we're always doing these things in the 25th hour of the day, and budget is always lacking, people are not responding. So how did you solve that in all these projects? It's really cool. I don't know who wants to go first.
I can start just by saying that I felt like it really did help having someone in-house and on staff take the lead on the project. I wasn't relying, on an agency, or I was also trying to keep our costs down. So it was helpful to have someone on staff take the lead and do the skeleton of what the project could look like. And then I have to give credit to our medical and scientific advisory board for stepping up and really helping to make sure that all of the information was perfectly accurate. Of course, we chose the members of the board that are most proactive and responsive, and knew the ones that would get back to us fairly quickly. So that, I think, helped us keep the costs down and also keep the project moving. Also, it was very important to find the right graphic designers. And so we explored a couple of different options for graphic designers, and we found, the designers that tended to be more responsive and work more quickly so that we didn't have as many delays.
I think for us, I had a thing of don't let the pursuit of perfection stop the delivery of good. And I think a lot of the time, if we're in under-resourced situations, it's merely taking that first step that is the biggest and the hardest step to take. And being willing to learn on the fly and learn as you go. I think often certainly for me, I get caught up in making sure that it's the correct methodology and it's the correct that. But at the end of the day, it's been said here, we're patient groups, and yes, we do have to be credible, and we do have to have information, and we do have to put forward stuff. But at the end of the day, we're still patients. As I say to a patient, you don't need to be a lawyer, you don't need to be a doctor, you don't need to be a politician to be a patient. You're a patient. That comes first. So for me, I think that it is trying to keep that in mind when you're collecting data and asking people to give you data. That's at the end of the day the foundation for that collection and that data.
Yeah, I mean, I'd absolutely agree as well. I mean, one of the things I say quite a lot is how do you start doing it? You start by starting. You can sit around for a long time saying what's the best way of doing this and never run a project. And I think the other thing is we have to acknowledge that certainly from the project we had in the UK, we had a lot more resources to put into the project than most patient groups would be able to do. We worked with an accredited survey company to run the survey, who also run surveys for NHS England. We did some of the reporting in-house. We have paid staff that we were able to put time against it. So we know definitely the level of resources that went on this project might be different than what some of the other groups might be able to allocate to it. So it is different in that sense. But the other thing is you don't always need to have to be the one who generates the evidence. You just have to be the one that uses it. And I mean, that's kind of why groups like Alan, with the international survey that's being run at the moment, you don't have to design the survey yourself, but what you do have to do is you do have to promote it to patients in your country to complete, so that there are people who've responded from your country. And that way, you might not need the kind of expertise to develop a survey, and you will have a survey and results for you that you can use for evidence in your own country for advocacy. We know that not all groups have that resource in every country. Yes, we can do it in the UK, and we can do it in the US, and we can do it in some of the other countries as well. But in some countries, running that type of survey is just impossible. And that's, for me, why groups like Alan, CML advocates and CLL advocates are actually so important, is because none of us want to do these things alone. We can do them together, and we can actually do them better by doing them together than we could ever do them alone, because we can do comparisons between countries, and we can say, even from a UK and US perspective, where we could run it on our own, we can't run it as well on our own. We can all run it better still. And that's, for me, the value of groups like this, and that's why I'm so excited to see everyone and speak to everyone, is because these projects are better when we do it together. That's the power of the patient community.
I could hardly agree.
Never say something that someone else is willing to say on your behalf.
Diana?
I could hardly agree more with what Zach says, because for many years we have been, I mean, my organization has been a part of different blood cancer networks, and that's the only way how we can get data to talk about them within our country, with medical societies, with other stakeholders, because alone in a small country with a small population and small numbers of patients, not speaking of the financial resources, this would be impossible. So the advantage of contributing to the networks, on the other hand, whenever there is a survey which is available in our language, we try to do most of it, like in the adherence survey, to optimize the number of respondents. This was done by individual emails to the members of the organization. Otherwise, we would have never reached that number if only relied on Facebook or website. So we're happy to contribute whenever possible, and then we also benefit from the outcomes of these very valuable projects.
Just to add to what Jana said there as well, absolutely, it's our experience that emails are much more effective for recruiting people for surveys than social media. You might see lots of people like, tweet, share, whatever the survey, but the number who click on the link is much smaller. So it's really only about social media reaching those who might not already be in your community, or who might be less engaged with your community. We definitely find emails are the kind of best way of doing this. And I know Samantha shared some kind of graphics and copy and template that's pre-prepared if people want to use and adapt it. It's in English, it isn't translated, but if you can do the translations, I'm sure we're happy to help with adapting the graphics if anyone wants to do it specifically in their own country. The aim here is to make it really easy so one person's doing it and we all use it, rather than 30 of us having to do it individually. So yeah, really exciting.
Definitely. I wanted to add too quickly, as we were talking before about the surveys, there's a place for these larger surveys, which I love. And I think that that's wonderful. But just to point out, they don't always have to be very long surveys. If you have a specific topic in mind that you really want to learn about, a 3 or 4 question survey can yield fast responses and really get you that information you're looking for. Sometimes I definitely see a place for the larger surveys, but I also like the idea of smaller surveys with a more dedicated purpose.
Totally agree. If I can jump in, Tracy, on something you said in your presentation as well, I know you've got the MDS Alliance campaign planned for MDS Awareness Day. Is there anything kind of you'd encourage people to do if they want to get involved? What's the best way of doing it? Because I know many people are active in both acute leukemia, MDS, as well as other blood cancers.
Sure, absolutely. So on the MDS Alliance website, it's mds-alliance.org. There's a banner. You can see it. If you click on the banner, it shows you ways that you can get involved in that campaign. You can view the animations there, but there's also images you can share on social media. And there's posters that you can download if you want to take a picture with the poster or just share the poster. You can do that as well. And I know that the group has sent through the animations. They are translated into multiple languages. I think we're at 9 or 10 languages for translations, but if your language isn't on that translation list, we're offering PowerPoint slides so that you can translate it yourselves and then use it kind of as an overlay for your region.
Jan.
I mean, you see that I'm really burning for this topic. So I hope I'm not discouraging anyone else to ask questions, but unless there's another one. One thing that I always think about is data ownership. And I know because we as patient organizations run these projects, usually we own the data, so we can go back. But the experience we've made in CML Advocates, both with the adherence survey as well as the TFR survey, is that we contract an agency, they run the survey, we get the analytics, we get all the questions responded to, and then project finished. Then 1 year later, you come across another idea, what you actually could derive from the data, which you haven't looked at in the beginning, but then agency is gone. Maybe the staff person there who did the analytics or the SPSS or whatever is also no longer there. And then you struggle to actually later on reuse the data. How have you tackled this in your projects? Have you, how do you deal with this, that you want to probably use the data 1 year later again? Have you thought about this? Have you done this in the projects? How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, so we've definitely done this with our Living with Leukemia survey in the UK. The Watch, Wait, Worry campaign I mentioned, we didn't do that campaign until, I want to say something like 6 to 12 months post-survey. It wasn't one of the original analysis. I mean, definitely we wanted to include Watch and Wait. We had a whole series of questions about it, but we did an analysis that we hadn't previously planned, which was basically looking at 3 different groups of Watch and Wait. People who start at diagnosis for CLL started treatment straight away, i.e. not Watch and Wait. People who went on Watch and Wait at diagnosis and were still on Watch and Wait at the time they completed the survey, and people who'd been on Watch and Wait at diagnosis and then went on to have treatment, to see whether Watch and Wait then treatment was different for their experience from treatment. Things like access to a clinical nurse specialist, for example. We found that people who were still on Watch and Wait didn't have a nurse, but those who'd been on Watch and Wait originally and then gone to treatment had got the nurse at the point they started treatment. So definitely it is possible if you do it in a certain way. Like you say, it depends how you work with the agency. We've worked with the same agency on projects for a period of time, and they've been very helpful in terms of doing follow-up analysis that we hadn't previously planned. And depending on the type of survey platform you use, we had something which basically was an online platform, and all of the data was plugged into it, and you could, fairly simple, but you could do your own analysis from it. That platform was quite expensive, but very useful because it allowed us to do different types of analysis over a period of time. And equally, sometimes you do just have to run another survey, which, especially if you want to do a little bit of a deep dive on a different type of topic, you will never answer all the questions you want to answer in the survey, unfortunately. If you do, you're not asking enough questions. But we've run things like focus groups ourselves to try and understand some of the findings and stuff beyond it. Yeah, as you know, I'm a big fan of evidence-based advocacy. So we're always doing a project. So there's always a different way to generate the evidence if you've missed it. But it is one of the big limitations if you don't, which even we don't have the capacity to run these projects ourselves. If you don't have the capacity in-house to do some of these things, and you don't have the software and the platforms and the statisticians and the survey kind of technology to do it on anything other than Google Forms or SurveyMonkey, you don't have the data yourself. You have a aggregated, anonymized data set that you can analyze and report in different ways, but you are kind of beholden to others sometimes. So it's not a perfect solution, but we've found ways around it kind of most of the time, and that's possibly because the agency we've worked with has been pretty good. I know others have had a much less positive experience with others where they've done, project done, finished, can't help you anymore.
So we took another approach in that one of the things we're very, very lucky to have is to have a significant amount of pro bono legal advice. So anytime something was contracted, we ensured that that information, they were the conduit to that, and that we were we had access to data and so on, and that they were seen within the laws of the country, and that it who did ownership, where the ownership lay, and how they had to deal with that data.
Everyone is silent. Someone would like to add something? Jan, do you have another question? Don't look.
I've got a question for Jana, if I may, about the CML Advocates Adherence Project. So one of the things I think patient organisations quite often struggle with is the evidence being seen as credible by the clinical community. And I know that CML adherence project was a really strong example of changing the clinical mindset on a topic. They didn't believe adherence was an issue before, and obviously now in CML everyone knows it's a major issue. So what did you think were the main factors that helped that CML kind of be successful in changing clinical perspectives?
I think it was the number of respondents, because this was really, because it was global. There was more than 2,500 respondents from around the world. So that basically even different cultures and different mentalities were captured. So we saw adherence is a problem which goes across the world. Whenever the patients are in all continents, it seems to be very similar. So I think it was the number of data, because before there hasn't been such a volume of numbers to persuade that really this is a representative sample.
And was there anything, because I know CML Advocates has done a study on treatment-free remission since the adherence survey, was there anything, kind of any learnings from the first project, maybe things that went wrong or things that were difficult, that were taken forward into the TFR project?
Well, I'm afraid, Zach, that in the TFR, I couldn't comment on that, because our organization did not participate, because while in the neighboring countries, TFR was already being implemented in clinical practice, we were somehow behind. The Czech Hematology Association did not start with implementing this. And only currently, I mean, in 2020, they came with their own approach, and this is an academic study called HALF. So it goes with the model of first halving the dose and then gradually stopping in the second term of the study. So at the time of the TFR research, the Czech patients would only theoretically talk about if they're willing to stop and what would be the criteria. Now that we have the academic trial ongoing, this is a different situation now, because many already have stopped completely, many have enrolled later, and they are on the reduced doses. And also now in the clinical setting, the different administration of drugs like weekends off or reduced doses are being implemented. So I couldn't speak of the TFR survey, because for these reasons we did not participate. We're waiting for the data from this academic trial, if and how the patient's concerns, if they are slightly different, if they're not stopping from full dose, suddenly going to zero, but they have this gradual halving dose and then stopping later on. So then, of course, the psychological issues are different. And also, they know they are in a trial with more monitoring and close contact with the hematologist. So, you know, in clinical trials, it's always a different regime. So we are in different position.
Thank you, Jana. I can see, Jan, you've got your hand raised. I don't know if you want to ask a question or whether you're going to comment on the CML experience.
No, I mean, because you asked, I just wanted to add to what Jana has said. I mean, we did a lot of things wrong in the adherence survey. It was still a good project, but I think we learned a tremendous lot what we shouldn't do the same thing again. And I just to highlight one thing it took us 3 years to publish the data that we gathered in the adherence survey, because we did a lot wrong there, because we totally overestimated the willingness of people to volunteer to write an article. And that's why we went from A to B to C to different people that actually should have said they would help us publish it, but in the end, they didn't find the time. And so after 3 years, it was really difficult to get the data in high-tier journals, just because it was already 3 years old until we actually failed on all other avenues. So in the TFR survey, it was in the plan from the start, and it was very clear how we did that. So we published in Leukemia in the journal at short time. And probably just advertising break, just because of that experience. Also, we pushed for in weekend to actually have the publications training course, because we knew that we were totally inexperienced ourselves in how to publish and where to publish and when to publish and who would help us. And that's why we've developed the weekend training course in Patients and Publications, which is a 4-module training, which is open access. So anyone who's interested to learn now, if you're doing evidence generation, how to get it out there, you can take the course on the weekend website. But I would say I've been so much in favor of doing this training or developing this training because we failed so miserably on the adherence survey in the beginning.
Well, and I think as well on the Patients in Publications training, as you say, it's an online, I think, e-learning course. There's 4 modules, and you can take the different bits of it. We've talked a lot about, and you popped the link in the chat. Thanks for that, Jan. We've talked a lot about evidence and very little about publications in this bit, because of course publications is just one part of the evidence process, but it's actually quite often a really important part, i.e. there's no point having a load of excellent evidence sitting on a shelf. And we know that for some stakeholders, only published stuff counts. So for the clinical community, if you want them to be interested, you do have to publish it. Unfortunately, that's the way science works. And in some cases, that's great, because it puts kind of sensible safeguards in the way we share scientific information, etc. But it does make it really difficult as patient advocates to get involved in the science. So it's not just campaigns like Alan and the other international networks campaigning to get to the conference. We also need to be presenting the stuff at the conference. We need to be sharing our kind of latest evidence. And to do that, we need to know how to publish. And I certainly think I was on the editorial board for the course, so I've seen it and I'm a big fan of it as well. But I certainly think it's really useful for anyone who's thinking about, we've done this kind of project, how do we get the word out about it? And I think it's worth taking a look at. Tracy, you've got your hand raised.
Jan made me think of something that I've learned recently, is not to underestimate the importance of a really good strategic partner. I think for us at the MDS Foundation, we were not doing a good job of capturing metrics from our website, of understanding who was looking at what and what people were finding valuable. And then we were approached by an organization who does animated patient videos, and in multiple disease areas. They're called the Animated Patient, and they wanted to do something in MDS and in AML. So we started working with them, and that's where I really learned, based on the metrics they were capturing on the videos, really what you could learn and what you should capture and what you can do with that. So now, because of that partnership and learning from them, we've had poster presentations accepted at ASH. We're doing a publication on you in MDS now, and it's something that I would have, had they not approached us and started that process, we wouldn't know how to do it. So partners are key.
Definitely, no point reinventing the wheel on things people have already made. I always say people have made the mistakes for you. Learn from their mistakes rather than making them yourself.
Exactly, and they do the heavy lifting, which is so important. We provide the disease-specific information with the patients and the professionals, but all of the media, they already know how to do. They've got a beautiful system, so it's a win-win.
And Lauren, you've got your hand raised as well.
Yeah, I think also, in less resourced settings, often there isn't any information that exists anywhere. So a lot of the times you could, at a point, do a small, say for instance, survey and publish that as your own, or in the form of a patient charter, or in the form of a call to action, or even in the form of a white paper or so on, to look at saying, you know, there is that opportunity, because in the vacuum of data, sometimes if you're able to create a reputation of credible information point that's used within your country, that can be just as helpful as something that's formally published and put forward in literature. So don't be afraid of using the data you've collected in your everyday work, especially when you're in low resource settings and there isn't data. You know, I think that's something that you can also look at and not discount.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I remember attending the British Society Conference Haematology in the UK, and seeing some of the posters of, say, like evidence generated through helplines that some of the other patient groups have presented, that we routinely collect at Leukemia Care and hadn't ever thought to present before. We've kind of gone, yeah, you need to generate a survey, you need to do it in a kind of methodological sense to specifically generate that data. But actually, that's a bit like a clinical trial. It's a cleansed environment. It's not real. It's not a why are people reaching out to support that they do through your helpline, for example. That is a much more organic way of doing it, and actually, obviously, also a less resource intensive way. So there are different ways to kind of think about generating evidence that you're already collecting and presenting it in a different way. The most important thing quite often is obviously putting it in the domain of other stakeholders who can listen and use to it, because otherwise, like I say, you're sitting there and not acting on the feedback that you're obtaining, and this evidence and data is so valuable.
Are there any more questions, comments to our panelists? Seems no. So I just would like to thank you. I would like to thank you for your talks. And Zach, do you want to give the final word to the summit?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, nice to see so many familiar faces. Nice to hear presentations from kind of advocates around the world of all of the different things that are happening, and the different needs and different issues and complete best practices happening all around the world. So it's very strange that we all keep coming together on Zoom still. Hopefully at some point we'll be able to all come together at an Allen face-to-face summit at some point in the future, which we obviously planned before the pandemic and haven't been able to do. There's some of you I've spoken to and met in person many times in other conferences, and there's some of you I've never met. So hopefully at some point in the future we all get to come together and meet each other in person and talk and share best practice at another summit in person in the future. But yeah, nice to see everyone. I hope everyone has a good weekend, whatever time of the day it is on Friday. So a good weekend when it comes, and take care, everyone. Really nice to see you all, and hopefully see you soon on another discussion and topic. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Anna.